Environment, chaired by the gentleman from New York, Mr. Scheuer, and the Subcommittee on Energy and Environment of the Interior Committee, which I have the honor to chair. Our purpose today is to discuss nuclear winter. This is a matter of such importance that Mr. Scheuer and I decided to hold a joint hearing since we had scheduled separate hearings, and this seemed a more efficient and effective way to go. I hope that today's testimony will result in a better understanding of questions that nuclear winter immediately calls to mind. What is it? What are its effects? How does it change our thinking about nuclear war? What should nuclear winter cause us to do that we had not done before we knew about it? And other questions. Some of today's witnesses will describe the nuclear winter phenomena. Others will tell us how they believe our strategic posture should be modified in the light of it. Before we begin, I want to say that it troubles me that we were nearly into the 5th decade of the nuclear era before our military planners explicitly accepted the potential destructiveness of the climatic effects of nuclear war. Such effect, it is now believed, could rival the damage resulting from more familiar effects of blast, fire, and fallout. It's worth reflecting upon the consequences of an attack by our Strategic Air Command on the Soviet Union had it occurred in the late 50s or early 60s. At that time, by all appearances, we possessed an overwhelming superiority. Our military leaders had reason to assure the President that the United States could attack the Soviet Union and expect little or no retaliation. If, on the basis of such advice, the President had decided in such a crisis to launch an attack, our targeting doctrine, I've been told, would have led to the detonation of thousands of megatons over Russian cities. The result would have extended far beyond destruction of the Soviet society. Some scientists now believe that such an attack would very likely have created catastrophic climatic changes in the Northern Hemisphere. Had this happened, our own society might have been destroyed even if the Soviets had not been able to launch a single weapon. If nuclear winter could creep up on us this way, what other surprises might be in store? The discovery of nuclear winter is an anticipated development that means nuclear war would be even worse than we had feared. By the nature of things, the unexpected is more likely to fall on the negative side of the ledger. Nuclear winter was found on ground that had already been well plowed by strategic theorists and planners. The failure of analysis is the sort of event that should lead us to question confident assertions that security might lie in the next technological breakthrough. We should, for example, be skeptical of promises that a Star Wars defense will allow a move away from a strategy of mutual deterrence based on fear of annihilation. Star Wars, we are told, could make possible a strategy based on defensive systems. And as desirable as this might be in principle, it is unlikely to work out in practice. In fact, by its nature, Star Wars would probably do more to create tensions than to reduce them. Finally, I hope we will not be distracted by snake oil. The belated discovery of nuclear winter should help us to realize at long last that the path to peace may be through arms control rather than through a never-ending succession of weapon systems disguised as bargaining chips. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Scheuer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to express my appreciation to you and your staff for the wonderful cooperation you've extended our staff in working out this joint hearing. It's appropriate today that we have this joint hearing inasmuch as today is the first day of serious discussions of nuclear countdown, nuclear strategy that will be taking place in Geneva. Under the nuclear winter theory that we're discussing, the fierce aftermath of a nuclear attack would send plumes of smoke, soot, and dust from burning cities, industrial sites, and forests lofting high into the atmosphere. And within weeks, these particles would cover the northern hemisphere and slowly drift into the southern hemisphere, blocking out most of the light and drastically reducing land temperatures. Under such conditions, survivors of a nuclear holocaust would face extended darkness and freezing temperatures. Rivers and lakes would freeze over, plant life would wither, and food production would be virtually eliminated in the ghoulish season of nuclear winter. The so-called victors of such a terminal battle would have little in the way of the spoils of victory as the effects of nuclear winter spilled over the far corners of the remnants of our Earth. It's apparent that the implications of nuclear winter impose new realities of nuclear arms control strategy and nuclear deterrence. At the very least, the nuclear winter theory raises profound implications for the U.S. and presumably for our Soviet colleagues too, imposing on all of us the necessity of new thinking, creative thinking, on issues such as nuclear weapons planning, procurement, deployment, targeting, and command, as well as for arms control and civil defense. Much of today's hearings will focus on the recent Department of Defense report, The Potential Effects of Nuclear War on Climate, which was requested by our distinguished colleague from Colorado, Tim Wirth, who is here with us today. In my view, it's difficult to square the 17-page DoD report with a mere 5 or 6 pages devoted to the policy implications of nuclear winter with the statutory mandate imposed by our Congress on the Secretary of Defense to conduct a detailed review of the current scientific studies, and I quote, a thorough evaluation of the implications of the theory, and a discussion of the manner in which the results will be incorporated into nuclear weapons, arms control, and civil defense policies. Nor are we assured by the level of resources committed by the Department of Defense to the study of this policy. Despite an overall weapons research and development budget of over $39 billion, the DoD requested a meager $2.5 million, less than half of the amount that the President's own science advisor, George Keyworth, requested for this study. Public debate on this issue must proceed from a careful scientific base and be guided by the best evidence available. Our intent is to air this evidence as openly as we can today. The issue of nuclear arms strategy and tactics and the impact that the theory of nuclear winter would have on that strategy is an issue which transcends all others in importance. Indeed, the fate of mankind rests in the balance, rests on our ability to cope with these incredible forces which man's ingenuity has unleashed.
Do you want to introduce the others, or do you want me to, or what?
Are there further opening statements? Mrs. Schneider?
I would like to commend my 2 colleagues and the 2 chairmen of the joint committees here for convening such a hearing. I think that there is very little question that the hearings that we're holding today are of profound importance. I recognize also that in the public's minds there is a feeling that we are facing disaster at every turn and that calamity lurks behind every bush. This is very unfortunate because far from crying wolf, the information that we are going to be receiving today is from scientists who represent a variety of disciplines on a topic that is as important as any that we are ever likely to face, the ecological consequences of nuclear war. The report that has been released by the Pentagon on March 1, called The Potential Effects of Nuclear War on the Climate, is an important addition to the awareness on the atmospheric side effects of nuclear war. But unfortunately, this report does not add much to our understanding of those effects, nor to the development of a mechanism to further investigate this problem. I find it unfortunate that the report carried a tone of defending current policies. To state that it is not our policy to target population centers is of very little solace when the destruction of the world's ecosystem is a possibility. Also, the strategic defense system would, in fact, discourage the Soviets from increasing their nuclear arsenals is the result of the report, and I think also a result of delusional thinking. To suggest, as the report does, that fire effects could be reduced by detonating the bombs closer to the Earth, and then as a postscript adding that such a tactic would be an increase in fallout, points out the critical need for understanding that a nuclear war would be totally unlike anything we've ever experienced on Earth. Uncertainty is the hallmark of our understanding of the possible side effects of a nuclear war. In the last 40 years, we've certainly had the opportunity to experience much with nuclear weapons. We've learned that we are capable of totally destroying cities, causing burning, mutilations of various victims, and when exploded in the atmosphere that they produce radioactive fallout, can cause illnesses, large amounts of dangerous byproducts, including strontium-90, could enter our food chain. But I guess the worst news about the nuclear weapons that we are currently developing is what we don't know. We don't know how many explosions the planet can absorb before it is permanently altered. We also don't know how the ozone layer might be affected by high-level bursts. We also don't know what it means to win a nuclear war. This examination of the potential for a nuclear winter needs to be expanded so that we can understand the lowest limits of irreversible damage to the ecosystem. It needs to be developed by a group that is independent, that has total and complete access to required information, and that is led by individuals who are courageous enough to follow the data wherever that may lead. We have a responsibility as members of Congress to ensure that every policymaker in the world is aware of these findings. Albert Einstein had said that the nuclear age would change everything. Well, everything except the way we think. Certainly, we have a continuation of the view of warfare that is as ancient as the practice itself. The more weapons, the better. Unfortunately, it will be exceedingly difficult to change that kind of thinking. Congress is constantly faced with the demands for additions to our nuclear arsenals, and the fact that we respond so readily is evidence of our failure to recognize that we have crossed an important threshold, one that demands a fundamental rethinking of the manner in which we provide for our defense. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Distinguished gentleman, New Mexico is ranking Republican on our subcommittee. Is recognized for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We in this country believe that the nuclear winter issue is of serious concern and should be studied. The Soviet Union is not taking the nuclear winter issue as seriously as the U.S. does. There are some major questions about the nuclear winter scenario. It hypothesizes that half the world's arsenal of nuclear weapons would be detonated. Frankly, many people do not consider that to be a credible scenario. Has an analysis been done of other scenarios where less weapons are detonated? Do the results of such an analysis also produce a nuclear winter? Likewise, the nuclear winter scenario depends on the release of large amounts of smoke and dust into the atmosphere as a result of massive fires started by nuclear weapons effects. There's a wide range of variation on how much smoke and dust would be produced. Clearly, a key research need is to better refine the estimates of how much smoke and dust will actually be produced. This committee's jurisdiction is civilian R&D. We should look into whether the existing research efforts in climatic effects and fire, etc., are useful in analyzing the nuclear winter scenario. We should also consider whether the research efforts in studying the nuclear winter possibility will provide helpful insights into understanding natural phenomena of peacetime interests. The nuclear winter issue should be taken seriously. We should ask, what are the policy implications of the possibility of nuclear war? The most obvious one is that we should avoid a nuclear war. Since the possibility of nuclear war is being viewed with universal horror, it is hard to imagine that we need to have our resolve to avoid a nuclear war strengthened. The second policy implication is that we should work towards arms reduction. Right now, the U.S. is meeting with the Russians in Geneva for that very purpose. Clearly, we're proceeding along the proper lines. If indeed we reach agreement on arms reduction, it will only be meaningful to the extent that all parties comply with the agreement. The U.S., being an honorable country, will clearly comply with any treaty on arms control. We need to verify that the Soviets would also comply. Therefore, we should ask whether or not the present technologies of verification are adequate. And also, we should consider what additional research and verification technologies should be studied. Finally, the nuclear winter scenario tells us that we need to think about other possibilities for defending our country that do not rely on nuclear weapons. Is the President's Strategic Defense Initiative the answer? Mr. Chairman, I will look forward to the answers to these and other questions during the hearings of the various witnesses. Thank you.
Gentleman from Colorado who's been a leader among those of us concerned on this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you, Mr. Scheuer, for such prompt response to the report that came from the Pentagon and having this hearing, I think, now just 12 days later. I would also like to associate myself in particular with the remarks of the gentlewoman from Rhode Island, who I thought was very, very clear and careful on the subject. Here we have the Pentagon effectively agreeing that the concept of nuclear winter is a valid concept, but the next step, what are the implications of that, appear to be ignored. What are the implications for the notion of first strike? What are the implications for the question of survivability? The Pentagon seems to say to us, even though we recognize that nuclear winter is a valid concept, the implications are that we should continue to do more of the same. It just doesn't seem to me to be a logical conclusion from the evidence that's available. That's why we're having this hearing today, is to see if that logic holds up or if there are further implications for the Pentagon that they should be pursuing in response to the law passed by the Congress requiring them to look at this in great detail. Look forward to this hearing, and I, again, gentlemen, thank you very much for putting this together.
Further opening statements? If not, we'll proceed with our first witness today, who is Dr. Carl Sagan of Cornell University, who's been in the forefront of the discussion on this important subject. Dr. Sagan, you're kind to be with us today, and we'd be glad to hear from you.
Thank you, Representative Udall. I'm very pleased to be here. Can somebody turn my microphone on? Thank you. I can do it myself, I see. Some years ago, when the first results of our study, the so-called TAPS study on nuclear winter, were becoming clear to those of us working on it, long before it was publicly released, it became clear to me that there were serious policy implications on the issue, not only the consequences in the Northern Hemisphere, but the consequences elsewhere in the world, the possibility which emerged clearly from our calculations that something much smaller, Representative Lujan, than a full exchange would still lead to almost the same effect as the full exchange, provided cities were targeted. In fact, on that, one of our cases was a case where less than 1% of the world's strategic arsenals were employed, but artificially constrained to be targeted on cities only. And there we got temperature declines of tens of degrees for months. So being a novitiate in this strange subject, I felt the need to talk to more experienced people, and we were able to put together a private discussion, in fact, here in the Capitol, with a range of senior workers in this field in previous administrations and other masters of dark arts. And the distribution was very good. The most senior member of the group who was there was Averell Harriman, in fact. And at the end, I presented what the scientific results were, presented some hint of what seemed to me the policy implications. And one response by a senior practitioner was the following. He said, "Look, if you think that the mere prospect of the end of the world is enough to change thinking in Washington and Moscow, you clearly have not spent much time in those places." And so by these standards, perhaps the Department of Defense report represents slight progress. I see in the charge given by the Congress to the Department of Defense requests for, quote, comprehensive study, requests for, quote, detailed review, requests for, quote, thorough evaluation. And I must say, I do not see this report as coming within light years of that requirement. If this were a paper assigned in a graduate seminar at Cornell University, I think I would give it a D, maybe C minus, if I was in a friendly mood. For 40 years, the Department of Defense has in effect assured us that there are no long-term climatic consequences of nuclear war, that the climate is not endangered. There are reports by the government through the years saying nothing to worry about. Then some scientists stumble upon a possible global climatic catastrophe, attendant, as I said, even to a relatively small nuclear war. At first we hear that this is liberal propaganda or distortions invented by proponents of a nuclear freeze. Then there are other studies. They tend to confirm the general picture. then the National Academy of Sciences, the Royal Society of Canada, the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, the President of the United States, and eventually even the Department of Defense acknowledges that there might be something to worry about here. Nuclear winter, if it were brought about, would be a disaster unparalleled in the history of the human species. And what is the Department of Defense's response? It's that while nuclear winter might happen, there are significant uncertainties, of course, nothing has changed. That the correct answer to nuclear winter is to continue to build many more weapon systems in aid of reducing weapon systems at some future unspecified time. Peculiarly, nuclear winter turns out to justify all the policies that the administration has just embarked on. Remarkable coincidence. There are no agonizing reappraisals. There are no changes in doctrine or policy. From their point of view, the discovery of a doomsday machine hiding in the arsenals of the United States and the Soviet Union hardly matters at all. It doesn't change anything. And by comparison, let's compare this with the study released just 2 months earlier by the Royal Society of Canada, the equivalent to the National Academy of Sciences of our northern neighbor, which says, we conclude that the nuclear winter hypothesis does indeed modify the global strategic position, and then they go on to indicate in what way. And I'll mention a couple of things about that report in a moment. Mr. Weinberger's 70-page report talks about the possibility that dangers from nuclear winter will be comparable to the other horrors of nuclear war. Well, how bad are those other horrors? According to a study by the World Health Organization, chaired by Nobel laureate in medicine Sune Bergström of Sweden, as many as 1.1 billion people might be killed outright in a central exchange involving not just the United States and the Soviet Union, but Europe, China, and Japan. And another 1.1 billion people would die subsequently from the prompt effects if they did not receive immediate medical attention, which of course would be unavailable because the doctors and hospitals are by and large concentrated in the target zones. Well, 1.1 plus 1.1 equals 2.2. 2.2 billion people, according to this estimate. Obviously nobody knows for sure. It might be more, it might be less. Well, that's roughly half the people on the planet, just a little less. If, as the Department of Defense now acknowledges, the long-term effects, radioactive fallout, nuclear winter, and so on, might be comparable or even larger, then the Department of Defense now acknowledges that nuclear war might mean the extinction of the human species. And in that sense, this represents an interesting departure for the Department of Defense. Certainly, I would say nuclear war means the destruction of our global civilization, and a not incidental aspect of which would be the destruction of the United States as a functioning political entity. Nuclear war is bad for government, bad for labor, bad for business, bad for people on a scale that remains unreflected, as far as I can see, in this administration's policies. Now, one significant consequence of nuclear winter is that nations far removed from the conflict, nations, if there are any, that have no part of the quarrel between the United States and the Soviet Union, nations in the Southern Hemisphere, might be utterly destroyed without a single nuclear weapon falling on their territories. It's a possibility. You will hear later from Dr. Schneider and others on recent work on involvement of equatorial and southern latitude regions. The Royal Society of Canada says, quote, nuclear winter globalizes the environmental impact of nuclear war, close quote. There is no hint of this in Mr. Weinberger's report. There is no reference to the Royal Society of Canada report. There is also no reference to a report done by a branch of the Air Force, a branch with what I think is the best acronym in the business, CADRE, C-A-D-R-E, the Center for Aerospace Doctrine Research and Education at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. This report was prudently commissioned by the Office of the Department of Defense something like a year ago. Mr. Wagner will doubtless be able to tell us more details about that. I visited with them in the early days of their work. This is a bunch of majors and lieutenant colonels and some faculty members from University of Alabama, Georgia Tech. Seemed to me very good, very broad, very conservative. Well, they've produced a report. Nobody seems to know where it is or what's in it. I understand it was published in January. What is in it? It'd be most interesting to know what this branch of the Air Force designated to study the policy implications of nuclear winter has to say about it. Also be interesting to know, why is it that that report has not been released? The military implications of nuclear winter seem to me to be very broad. For example, consider the question of battle management and damage assessment. There is a nuclear war. You have launched some warheads. You wish to see whether they have done what they're supposed to do. How do you find that out if the target zone is socked in with smoke and dust and fine debris? That is a narrow military consequence of nuclear winter. There's no hint in the Department of Defense's report that anything like that might be of interest to them, although doubtless it is. And then there are additional ranges of questions from how well do tanks function at -10 or -20 degrees centigrade? How well do air-breathing engines do in soot? All the way to major strategic questions, for example, the credibility of the policy of extended deterrence against a Soviet conventional attack in Europe in the face of nuclear winter. Put baldly, would the United States risk nuclear winter at home in order to defend West Germany? That seems to me an issue worth thinking about. Are there implications for protracted wars? Do we have to envision submarines that sit in the abyssal depths for 6 or 9 months until the soot from the first minor exchange, if we could imagine nuclear war so limited, settles out so that we can then have the second round? It seems to me that even from the narrowest of perspectives of the Department of Defense, this report is inadequate. The report does worry about what is generally called an asymmetry of perception. What if the United States is worried about nuclear winter and the Soviet Union is not worried about nuclear winter? Might there then be some strategic advantage that redounds to the Soviet Union because they are, in this hypothesis, too foolish to see what the consequences of nuclear war are? Should we also be too foolish to see what the consequences of nuclear war are? It's a very curious question, and it has lots of good answers. For example, a major high-level joint study between the United States and the Soviet Union of the policy implications of nuclear winter. If the administration is worried about what the Soviets know and believe, there are means to find out. There are means to enlighten the Soviet Union on this issue if there are some deficiencies felt. Now, asymmetry of perception is one thing. Asymmetry of vulnerability is another. Is there a difference in the consequences for the United States and the Soviet Union if there were a global or even northern mid-latitude nuclear winter? Let me read 3 sentences from the Royal Society of Canada's report. The Soviet Union's sensitivity to small climatic fluctuations is well known. Since 1972-73, they have endured repeated drought-induced or frost-triggered crop losses on a staggering scale, mostly in the new lands opened up in the last 2 decades. The nuclear winter hypothesis predicts much larger stresses for the interior of Eurasia. A nation hard-pressed to cope effectively with current natural climatic variability will face a vastly greater threat. There is no hint of asymmetry of vulnerability in the Department of Defense report. There is nothing on implications for agriculture at all. Nothing on biological implications, except that they probably would be bad. Nothing on the functioning of society after a nuclear war as a consequence of nuclear winter. Let me again just pull out the Royal Society of Canada's report. Royal Society of Canada is a very small organization, very limited resources compared to those of the Department of Defense. Here, for example, Mr. Chairman, is a graph of how the area of Canada capable of growing mature wheat declines as there are temperature declines. So with a 1-degree decline, it's all down there. With a 2-degree decline, there's hardly any place left in Canada where wheat can still grow. Be very interesting to see this graph extended into the United States. What temperature declines are necessary to wipe out agriculture in the American Midwest? This is surely within the ability of the Department of Defense to do. No hint of any such study is shown here, and incidentally in the greatly attenuated national plan for studying nuclear winter, there is no money at all allocated for biological, agricultural, social, or other implications. It's all, and strategic implications. Everything is in the physics. Now, it is, to me, remarkable that there is virtually nothing in this report about the implications of nuclear winter for the relations of the United States with other nations. And there have been, within the last year, some dozen prime ministers, other national leaders of various nations, most of whom are allied with or friendly to the United States, expressing grave concerns about whether nuclear winter has implications for those nations and their relations with the United States and the Soviet Union. And these proposed implications go all over the lot. Some nations concerned that nuclear winter makes them much more vulnerable. But other remarks, for example, one which, if I read it right in the New York Times, attributed to Prime Minister Papandreou of Greece, says if there's nuclear winter, then Greece will be destroyed anyway, never mind whether Soviet nuclear weapons fall on Greece. So what the heck, we might as well have American military bases here. At least that's what it seemed to me the New York Times was saying. I may have misread it. An unexpected consequence. Now, on the question of funding for further research, I've indicated, first of all, the grave omissions in the plan that was encouraged by the President's science advisor, George Keyworth, and as far as I can tell, Mr. Keyworth did a very good job in recognizing the seriousness of the problem. Originally, this was supposed to be $50 million over 5 years. It now has been reduced to something like half of that, and there's an interesting question about how much of that is really new money and how much of that is simply relabeling money that has been already programmed to study areas of this sort. Also, an important part of the administration's funding plan is how little money is given to the National Science Foundation, which is, as far as I can tell, the sole source of support for university scientists, independent scientists, scientists not already working for the Department of Defense or the Department of Energy, to study this. I'm sure the administration does not wish to have its funding plan be misinterpreted, that the administration is afraid to sponsor further research on the subject by those who are not directly under their thumbs, university scientists especially. It is now subject to such a misinterpretation. For 40 years, this administration, most of the principals in it, have been implacable foes of arms control. Now, we are told, and this seems to be one of the principal conclusions of the Department of Defense's report, they say, in effect, give us $1 trillion more or less for Star Wars, and another $1 trillion more or less for new offensive weapon systems, and trust us. We are dedicated to arms control. The Department of Defense is full of people, I know from first-hand discussions, with grave misgivings about current strategic policies, current arms buildups, and Star Wars. I find it remarkable that the DoD does not consider it its duty to present both sides of the argument. Congress does not hear from experts within the government who have grave doubts on these issues. Loyalty to the official doctrines of the moment is the paramount consideration. Whereas a free debate in which both sides are confident that under those circumstances the truth will out, that seems to me the prudent approach to issues of this magnitude and this difficulty and this seriousness. Mr. Chairman, I have just a couple of concluding remarks, and they are on Star Wars and the connection between Star Wars and nuclear winter. And I do this only because Star Wars seems to be the leitmotif of the report by Mr. Weinberger on nuclear winter. First of all, everybody acknowledges that fully impermeable strategic defense systems are not in the cards, certainly not for the next few decades. I point out that a system which is between 90% and 99% impermeable, far in excess of what most even sympathetic critics believe can be done, that such a system would permit enough Soviet warheads through an essential exchange to destroy the United States. So even after $1 trillion, there is a very serious question of whether the United States could survive a nuclear war. I also point out that if it is true that the destruction of 100 cities, something like that, is enough to trigger nuclear winter, even a full-up Star Wars system might not be able to stop it. And if there were an exchange and the Soviets did not have their own strategic defense system, then American attacks on the Soviet Union alone would be sufficient to trigger nuclear winter, at least possibly. Second point is that one of the major Soviet responses, they've already publicly announced that they would be driven in this direction if the United States appeared ready to go ahead with a serious strategic defense initiative, is for the Soviets to build more offensive nuclear weapon systems, to saturate, to overwhelm the defense system. But that is the worst possible case for nuclear winter. What nuclear winter says is that there are too many nuclear warheads in the world. And for the response to nuclear winter to be a sequence of events which leads to the Soviet to greatly increase their arsenals seems to me profoundly foolish. Star Wars is a kind of Maginot Line in the sky, and it has all of the deficiencies of the standard Maginot Line, except that it's vastly more expensive and that it can lead to much graver consequences even than the Maginot Line mentality did. Now, the actual situation to bear in mind in a full exchange some decades from now with a Star Wars system is to imagine something like 10,000 nuclear warheads in the air from the United States towards the Soviet Union in near space, surrounded by a cloud of something like 1 million decoys and penetration aids. Your job, should you choose to accept this assignment, is to pick out every one of the 10,000 warheads, ignore every one of the 1 million penetration aids and decoys, and you have 10 minutes or less to shoot down all the warheads. If you miss a few percent, everybody is dead. That's your problem. You're willing to bet your life on a battle management computer where the program is too difficult to be written by human beings. It has to be written by other computers. The program is too difficult to be debugged by human beings. It can only be debugged by other computers. The system cannot be tested at all short of a nuclear war. And now the system can only be operated by a computer. No humans involved except for the consequences. And if the system fails, the world is destroyed. Now, I submit to you that you have to be really Looney Tunes to bet the human race on this one. The only way to be really sure is for major, dramatic, bilateral, verifiable cuts in the strategic arsenals. Congresswoman Schneider quoted Albert Einstein, who said in 1945 that the advent of nuclear weapons had, quote, changed everything except our way of thinking, and thus, he said, we drift towards unparalleled catastrophe, close quote. That's what's most missing from this report, even a hint of a change in our way of thinking. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sagan, for a provocative and interesting introduction to this important subject today. We apparently have good attendance from both subcommittees. I suppose we ought to operate under the 5-minute rule in fairness to everyone.
Yes, indeed.
All right. I'll defer to my colleagues and begin with the co-chair of these hearings, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Schroyer, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Sagan, you've given us a great deal to chew over. And the question is, where do we intervene? Where do we crank in this new factor of nuclear winter into existing arms control strategy of all kinds? The Defense Department does have some ameliorating limits on nuclear hits, for example. They have, under the CIOP, the Single Integrated Operational Plan, they do have a criteria known as restraints on collateral damage. And that means that they will normally use the smallest weapon to take out whatever the target is. They won't engage in overkill on any one target. Now, that seems to indicate at least a move in the right direction, that they are thinking of minimizing damage above and beyond what is necessary to take out a particular target. Can you conceive of another criteria that would involve perhaps an urban fire critical mass, which is what produces nuclear winter, that would take into account number of weapons, kilotonnage of weapons, number of cities hit, the spread, the distance between cities, prevailing winds, temperature, time of year, and so forth, that would give the Defense Department some kind of maximum number of nuclear weapons, total kilotonnage, distribution, and so forth, that would provide a further limiting criteria, as they've already established one, but this would be a further limiting criteria addressed to the concept of nuclear winter and addressed to the concept of avoiding whatever the threshold is, assuming there is a threshold, and that we don't just move gradually by incremental steps into a darker and darker and darker period. Can you think of some way that under this overall master plan that they call CIOP, such a factor could be introduced?
Well, first of all, the United States is not the only power that can trigger nuclear winter. So even if we were 100% convinced that the latest PSYOP makes every effort under firm controls not to target populated areas, not to do all the things that would maximize nuclear winter, there is the question of the strategies of the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China, all of whom, as far as we can tell, might have arsenals large enough to trigger nuclear winter, and the last three mentioned, because of the nature of their arsenals, are primarily targeted on cities, entirely Soviet cities. So that's the first concern that I would raise about this issue. Any solution to this problem that involves targeting raises questions of verification. How will the Soviets be able to believe us that we don't target Soviet cities? How will we be able to believe the Soviets that they don't target American cities? Will we have American military officers looking into the innards of the guidance system program of Soviet missiles? Will we allow Soviet officers to do the same for American missiles? It seems extremely unlikely. And therefore, bland assurances on the nature of the PSYOP or the RISOP, the Soviet equivalent, simply don't carry much weight, it seems to me. On the question of whether U.S. PSYOP does or does not maximize nuclear winter, there are a diversity of points of view. For example, Admiral Noel Geiler, the former deputy director of the Joint Strategic Target Planning Staff, the guys who do the targeting, said in testimony before the Joint Economic Committee, can't remember, some months ago, that the co-location of strategic targets and cities and strategic targets and forests was so great that even an exchange which was designed only to hit strategic targets would burn cities. And along those lines, the report by Mr. Weinberger that we heard talking about has a very curious phrase. It says, "Our strategy consciously does not target population." Now, maybe consciously means intentionally, or maybe consciously is intended to be counterpoised to unconsciously. It's very hard to understand how you could imagine a central exchange in which submarine ports are not targeted, they're in cities, in which secondary airfields distributed over a country are not targeted, they tend to be in cities, in which command and control facilities are not targeted, they tend to be in cities. Any thought of decapitation involves targeting cities, and it would be very interesting to hear a presentation on precisely how it is imagined that there would be a nuclear war at various levels in which cities are not targeted. Maybe there is such an explanation.
Well, isn't that a sort of a semantical problem? It seems to me a little disingenuous for either our country or the Russians to say they don't target cities.
I agree with you entirely.
What they do is target strategic targets, industrial targets, government targets, and so forth, and they are generally located in cities.
By accident.
By accident.
Everybody's highly moral. Nobody intends to kill people. It just turns out that strategic targets kill people. That attacks on strategic targets kill people.
Okay.
One final thing on that, Congressman Scheuer. I'm not sure to what extent Congress has oversight on PSYOP. But it seems to me it's clearly and properly a highly classified area. But it seems to me that because the details of the targeting are now of general concern, that it would be useful for some selected members of Congress under some properly secure circumstances to look into PSYOP and see if what is alleged is in fact true.
I couldn't agree with you more on that. There seems to be an urgent need for congressional oversight. We all have a top security clearance, but it seems to me that at a minimum, the members of the Armed Services Committee, the Foreign Relations Committee, and the Intelligence Committee should be briefed and should be involved, not only in briefings, but in input on just the kind of value judgments that we have been talking about. How do we factor in the concept of nuclear winter in our PSYOP plan? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlewoman from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Sagan, I'm curious about which of the many uncertainties we ought to attack first. The Department of Defense recognizes the importance of improving our understanding of some of the technical underpinnings of the convincing hypothesis of a nuclear winter. And I'm just wondering, to what degree is there some variation on the actual quantitative impact of a nuclear winter? The Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory has suggested that this concept may include, the whole concept of a nuclear winter could include a whole range of possibilities and not just an extended period of sub-freezing weather. The fact that there would be firestorms and the heat would rise, thereby minimizing the freezing temperatures. How quantitative can we get in the predicting of this information, and should we seek further research into this area on the part of the Department of Defense or other federal agencies?
Nuclear winter is not a problem amenable to experimental verification, at least not more than once, and few of us wish to perform the experiment. It is therefore restricted necessarily to the best theoretical physics, the best computing programs, and the best small simulations that can be managed. every one of those, of course, should be vigorously pursued. And I'm concerned that the level of funding that the administration, under restricted budgetary circumstances to be sure, has proposed is inadequate. But at the same time, and by the way, other witnesses will provide their opinion on the degrees of uncertainty, Dr. Carrier, for example, who chaired the National Academy study. But at the same time, it seems to me it would be a grave error to say that we should not look into the biological, the societal, the strategic implications of nuclear winter until all the facts are in, because all the facts may never be in. Here is a sentence from the Royal Society of Canada report on this very question. At some point, the strategists have to accept the probability of the predicted consequences and incorporate that judgment into their thinking. Scientists tend to cloak their predictions in a shroud of ifs and buts. Royal Society of Canada is not criticizing scientists. That's the nature of scientific work. But every aspect of the nuclear strategic issue is surrounded by uncertainties. And there are uncertainties. We just talked about one. What are the Soviet psyops? What are the American psyops? What is the uncertainty of the Strategic Defense Initiative? What is the uncertainty of the gaps, the famous window of vulnerability? How uncertain was that? It drove the arms buildup, partly, that we are now in. I would like to see an even-handed concern about the reliability and verifiability of every aspect of this problem.
Okay, let me also ask you, the Department of Defense report reviews some of the Soviet perceptions, and the conclusion that they reach is that the Soviets have really done very little work on this subject. Are you in agreement with that?
The Soviets, in my view, have not done nearly as much as they should, and I hope will. It is, however, fair to say that the first three-dimensional general circulation model applied to this problem that gave results, or at least one of the first two, was a Soviet program, admittedly run on a computer with roughly the capability of an IBM PC, and with a program that ultimately comes from Oregon State University. But they at least did the study. The Vice President of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, Yevgeny Velikhov, told me that he has a budget of 2 million rubles for the next few years to work on this problem. It'll be very interesting to see what the money is used for, if it is. But if we are to believe his statement at face value, the Soviet program is roughly of the same order of magnitude as the present U.S. program. But I think it is absolutely proper to raise public concerns about the level of the Soviet research effort in this area.
Have you been involved or had the opportunity to review some of the data that's being put together by other federal agencies, such as, for example, NOAA, who is reviewing the climactic alterations and to some degree the biological impacts of a nuclear winter?
I was a consultant to the National Climate Office at NOAA that put together a plan to study nuclear winter. I was one of the reviewers of it. I thought it was by and large a very good plan, and I testified, I believe, before Mr. Shory's committee to that effect. But it is greatly compromised by being restricted only to the physical effects. Nothing about biology, nothing about society, nothing about policy, strategy, and doctrine.
I think in the federal government could best supply us with a societal analysis of the impact of the nuclear winter?
Good question, and I had correspondence with Mr. Keyworth on just this issue. I believe that this, as many other aspects of the nuclear winter implications question, ought to be farmed out to universities, research institutes, and so on, and not restricted to the federal government.
Thank you very much.
Gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Sagan, again, thank you for your help. When Congressman Leach and I initially proposed this amendment and it was passed by the Congress, it was our belief that this was an enormously important discovery, nuclear winter, and that the Pentagon should do two things. First, the Pentagon should come back to us and tell us if they believe that the concept of nuclear winter was valid. And second, if it was valid, what then were the implications? On the first, they have come back to us and said, yes, it is valid. On the second, from your testimony, and I would suggest from my own reading, they have not come back to us and really told us what the implications of this might be. Now, you said that if this were a graduate paper at Cornell, you might generously give it a D. Other actions that you have would be either to throw the graduate student out of school.
Hard to do in this case.
We can't do that with the Department of Defense. We can't throw them out, but we can. The other thing that you do is to say to them, go back and redo the paper.
Right, you give them an incomplete.
Okay, now, it seems to me that we have the opportunity of giving them an incomplete, and one of the obligations that we have, if in fact the concept of nuclear winter does have very broad implications for our targeting, for our arms control initiatives, for how we are developing our whole strategy toward the Soviet Union, then we should go back to them with a series of further questions, which we in the Congress clearly are capable of doing. What would be the first three questions that you would go back to the Pentagon with, saying, assuming that they have agreed that nuclear winter is valid, they have done so, what then are the next three most important questions to face the Pentagon with?
First short-term question I would raise is, please provide immediately the report by Cadre on the policy and doctrinal implications of nuclear winter. I think that would not involve going back and doing any more work. It's just the Department of Defense left home part of the assignment. Then beyond that, I would, I mean, my understanding is that that report exists. It's locked up somewhere. And so there isn't any rewriting necessary. It just someone has to reach into the drawer and hand it to the Congress. That ought to be done, it seems to me, if Congress requested, in 24 hours after the request. That should surely be a significant first step.
Secretary Pearl, there are two studies that apparently are significant and important. The Cadre study that's been referred to and the Palomar study that hasn't been referred to. At best, we would hope they could be released to the public. At the very minimum, we would hope they could be made available to members of Congress who have a top secret rating. Can you give us some assurance that these will be made available at least to the Congress and hopefully made public?
I'm not familiar. I have not read either study. Frankly, I'd like to read them first. We do have some limited pride of authorship, even though we're a bureaucracy, and if the Cadre study is as superficial and inadequate as I am informed it is, I think we'd be embarrassed to release it.
The Palomar study, too.
The Palomar study I'm not familiar with at all, but let me say we are not going to suppress the view of some officer who may have written some opinion that differs from the opinion of the administration. There are plenty of other people who can give expression to all of those views, and we enjoy the debate. And the suggestion that we are somehow suppressing dissident ideas about the implications of nuclear winter is just fundamentally wrong and unfair.
Well, judging from your performance this morning, you're well equipped and well qualified to cope with any debate that's likely to come in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Snyder?
Thank you, sir.
Secretary Pearl, are you of the opinion that the information that has been included in the DoD report ought to be expanded to incorporate some biological, agricultural, and societal impact studies?
Well, let me say, I'm not sure. I think it is vital to the decisions that the government has to make to explore every last physical phenomenon associated with nuclear war. We are well persuaded that nuclear war would be
Devastating.
terribly destructive. And whether it, I mean, it is a bottomless pit for research, given the inability to conduct experimental research, to speculate on all of the horrifying consequences of such a war.
One of the questions...
So I have no objection in principle to it, but it's not at all clear to me that this would be a useful investment of limited research resources.
One of the questions that this science committee so often is required to ask is that in the pursuit of answers to scientific questions, or looking for scientific answers, we have to recognize when is enough research. And obviously our discussions on acid rain have pretty much concluded. We've been doing plenty of research, yet the administration is asking for more money for additional research, and oftentimes it is perceived that this might be a way of saying, well, we just want to keep on researching it because we don't want to take any mitigating measures. I think there is concern among many members of Congress, and I certainly appreciate your comment. We can spend lots and lots of money researching this thing, but at what point and what information will be necessary to change the attitude and the policies of the administration and those who are sitting in this body?
But you see, there again, there's the presumption that if we only understood the phenomenon, if we only realized the circumstances under which a nuclear winter would occur, we would change our policies, which implies that the policies are an inappropriate response to the prospects of a horrible nuclear war, and I don't believe they are. You've been begging the question, all of you. I heard you say earlier that we have a view of warfare, the more weapons the better. I don't know whose view that is. That's not the view of the Department of Defense.
Well, then
certainly not my view.
Why in the constant debates before the Armed Services Committee and the debates on the floor are we shown charts by members of the leadership here in this body saying this is how many submarines the Soviets have and this is how many the submarines the United States should have in order to keep up with the Joneses? And I think that's the kind of mentality that is working among the decision makers now, and I think that I agree with you that that is a frightful way to be making, and a very uneconomical way to be making decisions as to what our deterrent posture ought to be.
But it's not how we do it. I mean,
It is how we do it here.
It may be that there are charts showing the relative forces on each side, but when we make a decision to develop a weapon or to procure a weapon, it is not because the Soviets have the same weapon or because they have them in larger numbers. The Soviets have vastly more air defenses than the United States. 13,000 launchers for surface-to-air missiles. We don't have a system like that. Haven't even begun one. Nor do we have any intention of doing so. So I think it's wrong to suggest that we are keeping up with the Joneses. I really believe that trivializes the very difficult problem we have in planning our strategic forces. And most of what we are now doing represents the replacement of obsolete systems that were deployed 20 and 25 years ago that are nearing the end of their useful operational life.
Well, let me get back to my original line of questioning. Your budget for the Department of Defense this past year has been $1.5 million, and it is slated for an increase of $2.5 million in '86. Whether that occurs or not remains to be seen. There are many of us that are looking at straight across the board freezes, including this area. I'm curious to know whether or not, seeing you question the need for continued research, is that kind of increase warranted? Do you believe?
Yes, I think there is a lot that we don't know, and I'm sure Dr. Sagan would acknowledge that there is a lot that we don't know about the phenomena that he's, in general terms, described. And we need to know more. What are the washout consequences of moisture in the atmosphere? How do different materials with different properties burn, and under what circumstances do they burn? How does the weather at the time of the war affect the calculation, and so forth? Now, at the end of the day, there's still going to be very sizable uncertainty. I don't think there's any question about that, but we ought to do what we can to narrow the uncertainties that now exist. All that has been determined thus far, in my judgment, is that at some level of nuclear exchange, there may well be climatic effects, and we take that very seriously. But I want to assure you we took very seriously the prospect of hundreds of millions of deaths even before we knew about nuclear winter.
You want to go ahead and ask it? Go ahead.
You ask him. You ask him.
Well, we are collaborating here, questioning how the attitude of that seriousness is reflected in the report.
Well, I think the report is a good report. It is a report intended to be read, for one thing, and we could have sent you 800 or 900 pages, which is the typical bureaucratic way to do it, and nobody would have read it, probably not even the staffs. It's a readable report. I think it's a fair and accurate report, and with respect to the implications of the nuclear winter phenomenon, I don't think the length of the report is the standard by which we should judge whether the issues have been identified. Mm-hmm. I realize there is disappointment that we did not, at the conclusion of this report, say we are going to abandon our historic attitude toward the construction of our strategic forces and the nature of our deterrent and our approach to arms control. I'm sorry about that. We couldn't satisfy you on that count. But that's because we believe that what we are doing with respect to our strategic force posture and arms control is basically sound. And it is made no less sound by the recognition that there are phenomena beyond those we already understood that would make a nuclear war even more horrible than we had already anticipated.
Well said. Thank you very much, Mr. Pearl. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Wirth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Pearl, as you know, this amendment grew out of a seminar which Congressman Gingrich and I sponsored for Mr. Teller and Mr. Sagan to come and talk to a large number of members of Congress. And I will speak to Congressman Gingrich, but let me in advance invite you and Dr. Sagan to come back, and maybe we could get the two of you together with that, because I think the implications of this discussion that we've had today are very significant and ones that many members should have the benefit of. I might also suggest that when you talk about the cadre study, it's my understanding that the General Accounting Office had done a preliminary look at the cadre study, had agreed that it was not a particularly distinguished piece of work. I would hope we might get your analysis of that back, as has been requested before, as well as an analysis and understanding as to what the Palomar study was and why that was not included in the report that came back to the Congress on the 1st of March. Also, you might have your staff send to us, if you might, the actual facts on the dollars expended in all of this. There seems to be some debate about that, which you raised earlier, saying that, in fact, a certain amount of money was spent. Science magazine had a different outline of that. Science had suggested, as best the story can be pieced together, George Keyworth, the President's science advisor, first sought to extract roughly $5 million in new funds entirely from DOD, and it goes on to say that money was not forthcoming. I think we'd like to just have a picture of who was doing what.
Simply a question of who pays the bills. You know, everybody thinks you can come to the DOD and tap into our budget.
The question was
the FY86 proposal is $5.5 million total on an interagency basis. $2.5 million of that will come from the Defense Department, $5 million of it from the Defense Department and the Department of Energy together. So we are, in fact, funding the burden of this. And, I must say in this connection that I think this money will be well spent by competent scientific personnel.
I'm not debating that.
Able to make the measurements that we're talking about, and I'm sorry I neglected to mention this earlier, the implication that the only independent scientists are university scientists. You know, there are a lot of things that affect one's scientific judgment other than who pays your salary.
Dr. Pearl, I appreciate that, and I appreciate your perspective on that, some of which I agree with, some of which I don't. I have a limited amount of time, and I do want to get on the record, you know, who is paying for what and how much is being committed. Let me go to the thrust of my questioning, which relates not to the uncertainty of the science. I think you and I should leave that to the scientists, but to the policy implications of nuclear winter. What concerned me in the report that we received from the Department of Defense was, on the one hand, agreeing that nuclear winter as a phenomena was a valid scientific concept. We're going to hear more specifically about that in later witnesses this morning. What concerned me, however, was the unwillingness or apparently non-recognition that there might well be other implications that came out of the concept of nuclear winter. And let me give you three that you know, I think I understand. One, the notion of survivability. That has been a concept which has been advocated by members of this administration and previous administrations, that in fact there was such a thing as a survivable nuclear war. If the concept of nuclear winter is valid, what are the implications of that for the concept of survivability? Secondly, targeting, which has been referred to. I think the situation is more ambiguous than the one that anybody has suggested today. Maybe one can come out and say that there are no implications whatsoever. On the other hand, you can't say, I think, as the report from the Department of Defense suggests, that there is no targeting of urban areas. I mean, you know and I know that that is not the case. A third concept, it seems to me, that ought to be examined in the light of the nuclear winter issue is the notion of a first strike. We hear an enormous amount of rhetoric and discussion over the last years, particularly in the debate on the MX missile, about what is first strike, what is not first strike. If nuclear winter is a valid scientific concept, does that or does it not make bankrupt the notion of first strike? That first strike, in effect, would be suicide. Consequently, we should not base a number of our targeting and other initiatives on the concept of first strike. There are a variety of implications of nuclear winter that break into the discussion of arms control, suggest different implications, which I think it is our responsibility and yours to wrap our heads around as best possible.
Let me just say that I think it is very difficult to go from the conclusion that nuclear winter is a valid concept to the conclusion that how one conducts or how one responds to a first strike or how one targets or one does not target or the issue of survivability, how we will reflect on that as a consequence of the concept. Because the concept, without diminishing the uncertainty, the quantitative uncertainty, isn't a very helpful guide. It can point you in a direction. It points us in the direction, reinforces the direction of withholding weapons from urban targets. It points us in the direction of seeking forces that are survivable in the face of a Soviet first strike capability. It pushes us in the direction of recognizing that a nuclear war, whether one survived it or not, would entail tremendous and unacceptable destruction. Obviously, it's tautological that when you refer to the nuclear winter concept, if what you mean is that there will be a nuclear winter as a consequence of any nuclear war, and that nuclear winter will extinguish life on Earth, then I don't think you have to be a genius to draw the appropriate conclusion about survivability. You're not going to survive. But when you talk about the circumstances under which a nuclear winter would be triggered, and how we and the Soviets, because we have to do this in a sense together, might ameliorate the situations, minimize the situations in which that would occur, that's a far more difficult proposition, and you can't answer that question simply by accepting the concept, because you've got to have some quantitative sense as well.
Clearly, the thrust of this hearing is not to say, yes, nuclear winter is bad, nobody disagrees with that the consequences would be devastating. What we're trying to suggest is that if nuclear winter as a concept is valid, then that has a number of implications, which you're suggesting in your answer now. That has a number of implications for first strike. That has a number of implications for survivability and different kinds of survivability, which I would suggest to you are not addressed in the report. Now, as the author of the amendment requiring the report, it is my responsibility to make sure, as best I can, that the administration fulfills what the Congress asked it to do. And it seems to me that there are a variety of implications in this which are not addressed, which are conceptual policy in nature, do not deal with the uncertainties of the science, do not deal with a number of the other issues that have been brought up here, but are ones of how are we dealing with various implications of this for such issues, again, as targeting first strike and so on. Those are not sketched out. Some are not even referred to in the report.
Well, if we've omitted a topic here
Or variety,
there,
yeah,
it's because we wrote our report and you didn't write our report, and you want us to write your report, and we
No,
would be
there are a
glad to
variety
go
of things.
back.
I would just suggest to you there are a variety of things, Secretary Pearl, in the amendment itself, language in the amendment, for example, of biological agricultural consequences, which are not addressed in the report. I would just say to you, I don't want to point a finger or be confrontational about this. I just think this is terribly important. A number of members think that this is terribly important, and would hope that it would not be treated, in an offhanded fashion. And I know you don't intend to do that.
If we have omitted points, we would be glad to go back and try to address those points. But the main point I wish to make is that the nuclear winter phenomenon parallels, in terms of its implications, our understanding of the devastating consequences of a nuclear war before nuclear winter was ever discovered, and therefore much of what we are doing and much of what we have thought about is only reinforced by the discovery of nuclear winter and does not run counter to it. And I could comment, if you wished, on survivability, on targeting, and on first strike, but it would all be in the same vein, that because of the consequences of a nuclear war absent a nuclear winter, we think we are doing the right thing with respect to targeting, and we think our attitude toward diminishing the Soviet incentive to strike first is an essentially sound attitude. On the biological consequences, again, I think one can carry this too far. And to attempt, when we are not even sure, can't be sure, about the circumstances under which there would be climatic changes, to do an elaborate assessment of the biological consequences of climatic changes seems to me to miss the point. The point is, we are persuaded in the first instance that a nuclear war would be a terrible thing. And we believe we have designed the policies as best we can, and it's an imperfect world, to minimize the likelihood of that war taking place. And understanding better the biological consequences of a period of protracted low temperature would not, in my judgment, alter our efforts to make the world safer and avoid that nuclear war. But if you insisted that we do that kind of research, of course, we'll do it. We try to be responsive to the Congress. But I don't think it has policy implications of the kind that the recognition that there is a phenomenon like nuclear winter has in the first instance. So I think it's a variation on a theme and not fundamental to what you and we are both interested in.
Well, I would thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would think that it's our responsibility in the Congress to define what we think are the fundamental questions to be asked, and we'll come back to you on that. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Okay. Congressman Lujan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Secretary, there seems to be the general conception in the committee that the Department of Defense or the government or government agencies are doing nothing in that research, yet I have before me a press release out of Los Alamos, just dated March the 1st, that talks about the nuclear winter being worse in the summer if it were to come about at that time, and the consequences would be different if we have, depending on the amount of rainfall that we have. So it seems to me like there is ongoing research by the Department of Defense on the effects of the nuclear winter. My problem is this, that we can understand all of those disastrous effects, but that leads us to the conclusion that we ought to avoid the war to begin with so that we're not concerned with the disastrous effects. And from what I see of administration policy, detente is, or deterrence rather, is one way to do it. Arms control, the President's stated objective of 0 weapons on both sides, if that could come about. SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, certainly to immobilize, to make inoperative any weapons that might come along. That certainly are steps that go towards saying we don't want the effects of nuclear winter to ever present themselves. Seems to me like we're in a good direction. Are there other things besides deterrence, arms control, as are now going on, SDI proposals? Are there other things that we can do to eliminate the threat of nuclear war completely. I think that's the way we ought to be going.
Well, I agree with you entirely. One of the things that we are doing, as I indicated earlier, is making reductions in the size of the force and in the megatonnage of the force. And as the accuracy of weapons improves, I think we ought to be able to move further in that direction. And when accuracy becomes quite perfect, we may be able to substitute some non-nuclear for nuclear weapons. Now, that is something that we are very keen to do if we can find ways in which to do it. We have to press on, as you've indicated, with the effort to get the kind of arms control that brings about serious reductions. And the kind we've had in the past hasn't done that, and that brings us to the parlous situation we now find ourselves in. So we have knowingly, willingly, and with our eyes open, set a standard for arms control that is far more demanding than has ever been set before. And it's going to make it a lot tougher to get an agreement.
But
if we get an agreement, it may help solve this nuclear winter problem, because the agreements we got in the past didn't help it at all.
Exactly, exactly. What I gathered from what Dr. Sagan said is that verification is going to be an impossibility, and that we ought to get a warehouse where, you know, you bring them in and then dismantle them and put them into power plants. Do you believe that verification is an unreachable goal?
I think it's difficult to answer that question in the abstract, although Dr. Sagan characterized our view as saying that arms control is impossible because of verification. I don't hold that view at all. I think the limits on our ability to verify, together with the Soviet record of violations of existing agreements, suggests that we should be very cautious with respect to some limitations. Limitations where a little bit of cheating would go a very long way. But in the main, we have put forward proposals that we think are adequately verifiable.
Yeah. This committee is involved, of course, in research and the new technologies and all those sorts of things, although we don't do the Department of Defense funding. It would seem to me like that funding of verifiable or verification technology should be a very high on our agenda, because perhaps we won't be able to have a general on site seeing where the targeting is, but at least if we have some new technology or existing technology to be able to verify something.
I think, if I may say so, the idea that emerged in your earlier exchange with Dr. Sagan, that the Soviets, how do we prove to the Soviets, how do we verify that we do not target their cities, seems to me to miss the point. The point is, it is not in our interest to target Soviet cities. It wasn't in our interest to target Soviet cities before the discovery of nuclear winter. If one takes nuclear winter seriously, it is even less in our interest today to target Soviet cities. And I think the Soviets are likely to be persuaded by the logic of the situation and not by what we say.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Huckabee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Pearl, Dr. Sagan has suggested earlier the possibility of a joint high-level scientific study with the Russians to study the effects of a nuclear winter. Would you be in favor of this or opposed?
If Dr. Andrei Sakharov represented the Soviet side, I would be 100% in favor of it. But if the Soviets are going to send over to participate in a study like that scientists who may or may not be associated with the KGB, scientists who are under instructions to come to certain conclusions and not others, and to follow the party line, then I don't think one can expect a fruitful scientific exchange. And it seems to me that as long as Dr. Sakharov is kept in the exile he's kept in, we have every right to be deeply suspicious about Soviet science and Soviet scientific exchange.
So you're saying you don't think a scenario would exist where you would favor such a study today?
I don't think we can expect to get objective and therefore useful results under the current circumstances of Soviet manipulation of scientific data for their own purposes.
Do you think we should be sharing all the data that we are acquiring and hopefully we will acquire in the coming years with the Soviets regarding nuclear weapons?
Absolutely. In the absence of an exchange, the Soviets are perfectly competent to evaluate our results. And I believe it's important that the Soviets be as well informed as possible about the nuclear winter phenomenon. It's obviously in our interest that they not, failing to recognize it, behave in a manner that brings it on. So I think we ought to make our research results available to the Soviet Union. But you don't need a highly politicized cooperative program in order to do that. The Soviets are, in fact, in my view, better able to evaluate our research when they can do it privately than in the context of an exchange program where they're forced to strike certain poses and attitudes for political reasons.
You've spoken earlier of arms reduction and this administration's goal to achieve arms reductions, yet problems with reducing to zero. At what level would you like to see both sides at?
Well, I believe that if we could get to zero, we would by no means have solved the defense problem, because non-nuclear forces would continue to exist. And we would obviously have a very serious verification problem, because the presence of even a few weapons surreptitiously retained would have an impact comparable to the impact of the first and only possession of nuclear weapons as it emerged in our hands in the closing days of World War II. For this reason, I believe that we can only hope to achieve a stable, complete nuclear disarmament if both sides have deployed defenses, so that any violation of the terms of that agreement might be met by adequate defensive forces.
Wouldn't it make more sense to significantly reduce and then proceed with a Star Wars type defense for both sides, rather than trying to proceed with a Star Wars defense while both sides have overwhelming numbers?
But that's not what we're doing. We're proceeding with a program of research parallel to a Soviet program of research, and no decision has been made, nor could any intelligent decision now be made to proceed with the deployment of a defensive system. I don't know what the results of the research are going to be, but our approach to the Soviets in Geneva now is to begin the process of deep reductions. We won't get deep reductions. There's not a prayer we will get deep reductions if the burden of opinion in this country and in the Congress in particular is that we ought to settle for shallow reductions, because the Soviets would much rather give us shallow reductions. Their proposals are for shallow reductions. If we don't get deep reductions, we're not going to begin to attack the problem of nuclear winter. So I hope you'll bear with us while we try to get an agreement that is going to be difficult to extract from the Soviet side.
Speaking of reductions, the intermediate proposals in Europe, I think you stated that this administration had proposed the total elimination of all intermediate nuclear weapons in Europe. Does this include the French and the British? I thought that was the hang-up.
No, I don't believe that was the hang-up, although I'm prepared to take the time, if you're able to take the time to discuss that issue in detail. We propose the elimination of U.S. and Soviet intermediate nuclear weapons.
Say that a little bit louder.
We propose the elimination of U.S. and Soviet intermediate nuclear ballistic missiles and cruise missiles in the INF negotiations. The Soviets claimed that they could not accept this proposal because of the presence of a very modest number of British and French forces that we neither control nor have any responsibility for or authority over. The Soviets knew we were in no position to dispose of the forces of the British and French. And so it was a showstopper, and I believe they knew that. And I believe that any objective assessment of their negotiating behavior in Geneva prior to the walkout makes it very plain that there was only one outcome that they were prepared to agree to, and that was the abandonment by the United States alone, unilaterally, of the NATO plan to deploy cruise missiles. And
were they willing to reduce to the same level as to what the British and the French have equivalent?
They said that they were prepared to reduce to the same level in a manner that would have left the United States with zero, and that calculated the British and French forces in a self-serving and unreasonable way.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Congresswoman Myers.
You mentioned, Mr. Pearl, that we had significantly reduced the number of warheads in our arsenal, and would you elaborate on that a little bit? What have we reduced, and when did we do it?
Well, we've done it rather consistently since the peak was reached in 1967, and the reductions have been brought about by the replacement of older weapons with new weapons, in which the older weapons were retired and in many cases replaced with a smaller number of similar weapons, or in some cases we simply abandoned that type of weaponry altogether. So the end result has been a reduction of 8,000 in the years since 1967, and a reduction in the megatonnage of that smaller residual force by 3/4. We have 1/4 today of the megatonnage that we had in the 1960s. Now, there are people who will immediately turn around and say, but our weapons now are far more effective, and of course they are. It's the increased effectiveness that has permitted the reduction to come about, which is one of the reasons why we've never been very enthusiastic about a nuclear freeze. And it seems to me a nuclear freeze is inconsistent with the effort to reduce by enabling a smaller and more effective force to provide the same deterrent capability. So it's been a consistent pattern of reductions. In Canada, at a meeting of defense ministers in October of 1984, it was agreed that a further 1,400 weapons would be withdrawn from Europe. Most of those will be dismantled. In fact, I think they'll all be dismantled. So the number continues to go down, but not on the Soviet side.
Yield back. Congressman Udall.
Secretary Pearl, Mrs. Myers seems to be talking either about build down or a close relative of build down. Is that correct?
Well, I think the question...
I think what I'm trying to get at, I was surprised at the 8,000 figure, that we actually have 8,000 less warheads or less launchers or less something.
Less warheads.
Less warheads. Has that been a process of modernization? Can you briefly tell me how?
It has been the consequence of the process of modernization. Look, you talked earlier in your opening statement, Mr. Chairman, about the 1950s, which was an interesting period. In the 1950s, I think it's fair to say that this country went on a nuclear binge and built every conceivable weapon in a nuclear version. I believe that was a mindless policy, and when it was evaluated toward the end of the 1950s, and in particular in the early 1960s, it was abandoned, and we have since the late 1960s been reducing the number of nuclear weapons, partly because we recognized that we had overdone it in the 1950s, and it was not necessary to possess nuclear weapons on that scale. I think we can go much further in that process. But if I could take a second of my time, you made one remark about the 1950s that I can't help commenting on, because it's an indication of how often the standard image is wrong, if I may say so. In the 1950s, and I was stunned to learn this myself, when our nuclear deterrent force consisted entirely or virtually entirely of B-47 bombers and a very large number of bombs, that's where some of these reductions have come from. Virtually the entire American arsenal of nuclear bombs was located at 2 military installations, one in Spokane, Washington, and one at Limestone, Maine. And had the Soviet Union preemptively attacked those 2 air bases, this enormous deterrent capability of the United States, a capability that probably could have produced a nuclear winter, would have been destroyed on the ground, and we would have had no nuclear retaliatory capability. And we didn't know it until the end of midway through the period, as a result of some pioneering work done at the RAND Corporation, we discovered the vulnerability of our strategic force. You've got to pay attention to that.
Could you give us, for the record, or maybe it's in the statement you had, some detail on this 8,000 figure, where, in what categories it occurred? I think it's an important subject, and I'd like to see it pursued.
Yes, I think we can.
Let me close with the commenting on what you just said, the 1950s. The thing that shocked me and that I was referring to in the statement is that if we knew nothing about this nuclear winter idea, none of us in the 1950s. We knew that blast was bad, and we knew that radiation was bad, and that grave damage could be done to the planet in any event. We now find that there's another, probably or possibly another effect that's equally bad to destroy the planet and maybe worse in some ways. But we wouldn't have as a country, but we could have theoretically made a first strike thinking that all the damage would have been in the Soviet Union and that the radiation might reach us through global currents and all of the rest. But we could have had the power to commit suicide, in effect, national suicide, without knowing that that power was in our hands. And I think that's one of the things that worries the nuclear winter people perhaps the most. Reminds me of the story of the woman, the wealthy woman, said to her driver in the limousine, "Drive off the cliff, George, I want to commit suicide." And it seems to me that this is an aspect of it that this is the thing that's new about nuclear winter.
It reminds me of that scene in a W.C. Fields movie where he's about to be hanged, and the hangman says, "Do you have any last comment to make?" And he says, "Yes, this is going to be a great lesson to me." No, I think your point is well taken. We are perfectly capable of doing stupid things because we're not fully aware of the consequences of our acts. It is not our policy. It is not our policy to plan for, prepare for, or carry out a first nuclear strike against the Soviet Union. And it wasn't in the 1950s either. And we stood by, even in the days of our nuclear monopoly, and watched the Soviets do a lot of disagreeable things without ever availing ourselves of that, that unique capability.
Why don't we, in that case, why don't we sign the pledge of no first use that's been argued about over the years? The Soviets say we've signed it, why don't you?
Well, first of all, we take pledges seriously, and when we sign them, we feel bound to act upon them. So we would have to change our policy. Our present policy is that in the event that we are unable to defend the NATO alliance in Europe with conventional forces, we retain the right to introduce nuclear forces into the conflict. Gratuitously, to remove that uncertainty that the Soviets must face would weaken the quality of our deterrent capability in Europe and expose us, in view of the Soviet preponderance in conventional forces, to an increased risk of conflict. And for that reason, we don't think it accomplishes very much.
Do our NATO allies still want us not to make such a statement or sign
Yes,
such a statement?
I believe they want us to stand with our current position. And our Gang of Four was answered by a European Gang of Four, I thought, rather persuasively.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Congressman McCain.
Mr. Chairman, Dr. Sagan was unable to answer the question that I had, and I request that he be allowed to answer for the record as to whether he believes the United States should embark on unilateral reductions of nuclear weapons if negotiations are a failure. So I request that he be allowed to answer that for the record.
Without objection.
Yeah, well, without objection, the record will be open for any member to address questions to any of the witnesses or the panelists for inclusion in the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Pearl, for, as always, a very eloquent testimony. You know, I'm also glad you brought up this very unfortunate aspect of what is a very important debate, and that is impugning the motives, the dedication to freedom and peace throughout the world of individuals who are taking opposite viewpoint. And I might say I think it's very much beneath Dr. Sagan and the outstanding reputation that he enjoys in this country to impugn the motives, the dedication to world peace, and the prevention of nuclear war by our President and our negotiating team in Geneva at this time. I believe that this debate is demeaned by doing that, and I believe that it's important that this issue debated on its merits and demerits rather than the motives of the individuals involved, which I don't believe that any of us are able to ascertain. My question to you is it indeed true that the Soviet Union has embarked on an SDI of their own?
Yes, it is now, and it has been, and that program began to gather momentum after the signature of the ABM Treaty of 1972. The Soviets were the first, as far as we know, to engage seriously in directed energy research, in high-powered laser research. They have an active program. They have the only anti-ballistic missile system deployed anywhere in the world today, and they are actively working on it to improve it. They have deployed, as you know, a large phased array radar in clear violation of the ABM Treaty in order to complete the nationwide coverage of the Soviet Union with a long-range radar. They are deploying air defense systems that we believe have significant ABM potential. In short, they have a vigorous program at all levels of science and technology. They're investing sizable sums in it. You know, 10 days after the President gave his speech in April of 1983 on the American Strategic Defense Program, there appeared an open letter in Pravda, reprinted a number of other places as well, signed by a very large number of Soviet scientists. And in this letter, they deplored the perversion of science for the purpose of building the weapons of war. And they also expressed the view, which we've heard a couple of times here this morning, that SDI couldn't possibly work. Well, we took this list of Soviet signers and we sent it over to the CIA and we said, can you look through your files and tell us what you know about these fellows, if anything? And they weren't able to identify all of them, but they were able to identify about half. And among the half they were able to identify is the fellow running the Soviet SDI program, the man who designed the Moscow ABM system, the designer of the Soviet SS-18 ballistic missile, the designer of the Soviet Typhoon-class submarine program, and I could go on because every one of the fellows we were able to identify, with a couple of exceptions, is up to his eyeballs in military research and development. So the Soviet position on this is built on a really breathtaking hypocrisy.
Well, to carry a comment you made earlier a little further, the next time we seek a joint project of scientific cooperation with the Soviet Union, particularly where it entails anything to do with nuclear or strategic weaponry, I think we ought to insist on the presence of Dr. Sakharov. I don't know of anyone who would be more qualified in the Soviet Union to partake in one of these joint studies. Do you?
I don't, and I must say I have been impressed with the degree to which the American scientific community has rallied around Dr. Sakharov, and I am concerned that that resolve to make the Soviet scientific community pay enough of a penalty so that Dr. Sakharov will be protected, that resolve may be weakening. I hope it's not.
Thank you. Isn't it true that the Soviet Union continues to develop and produce in an unabated fashion, chemical and biological weapons of war?
There is no question the Soviets maintain a very sizable arsenal of chemical weapons. They train in the administration of those weapons. It's an impressive program. They take it seriously.
Perhaps then we should have a study concerning the possible effect on the world of the unleashing of those weapons. Would you recommend that as well?
I think I would be inclined first to see whether we have already done analyses of that kind. There is no doubt in my mind that tremendous damage could be inflicted with chemical and biological weapons, and the biological weapons are a truly frightening prospect. Whether we need to do original research, I don't know, but we could certainly pull together what we think we know.
Finally, the Soviet Union is installing new leadership. Do you have any optimism about the possibilities for agreements between ourselves and the Soviet Union, particularly as regards to arms reductions with the new Soviet leadership, or do you see that it's just business as usual?
Well, I think it is almost certainly the case that Mr. Gorbachev has for some months now been a significant influence on Soviet policy. Whether the Soviets in this round of negotiations will demonstrate a greater willingness to negotiate toward significant reductions, I simply don't know. It remains to be seen. I know this: they won't do it unless they believe that they cannot get away with a kind of agreement that would be much more to their liking, which would be one providing possibly even for increases, but in any case for no significant reduction. So I hope we will have the patience, which we've lacked all these many years, to hang in there until we can get an agreement that moves us in the direction of solving this nuclear winter problem and doesn't simply legitimize the levels of weapons that Carl Sagan deplores and that I deplore and I think we all deplore.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, that completes your testimony, Secretary Pearl. We want to thank you for appearing before us this morning. And I must say that whether we agree with every jot and tittle of the administration's policy on arms control and nuclear winter, you certainly are a formidable representative of the administration here, and it's an intellectual treat to listen to you as it is to listen to Dr. Sagan. And we hope that both of you will beat your personally, on a personal level, even before we get to the solution of nuclear arms, that you will beat your swords into plowshares and never study war, interpersonal war anymore. We thank you very, very much. Congressman Udall.
For my colleagues, for planning purposes, we have 2 more panels. I think what we'll do is see if we can't get the first panel done in the next 25 or 30 minutes, then come back at 2 o'clock and finish up the last panel. Unless there's some disagreement on that schedule, we'll follow it, and we'll proceed now to the next panels. Jeremy Stone, Dr. George Rathjens, Mr. Williamson, and Dr. Brody.
I think one of our next panelists has a plane at 2 o'clock and can't get back.
All right.
Schneider
has a backup.
Schneider has it.
He has a backup plan for crazy.
What if we combine the panels?
Sheet all wanted to come back too. He suggested we can't do otherwise. We couldn't probably.
Mo,
Yeah.
what do you think about combining the panels?
We could do that. Stay and
What do you
finish it
think?
all.
Yeah, just do it, knock it right off. And ask them all to summarize their testimony in 5 minutes. What if we did that? Ask them all to summarize their testimony and do.
George, I want you to sit here. Mr. Worth suggests, and I think I'll follow his suggestion, that because panel 2 consists of just 2 additional witnesses, we'll combine all the panels and give each of them about 5 minutes for summary remarks, and then we'll go to questions. So Dr. Carrier and Dr. Schneider, if you'll hold yourselves in readiness, we'll put you on at the end of the panel. This panel, we'll just combine the 2 essentially. Dr. Jeremy Stone, Director of the Federation of American Scientists. Dr. Stone, glad to have you here today, and you may lead off.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the committee is struggling to figure out what is the new thing about nuclear winter that surely must be there that implies some change in American policy. And not surprisingly, both sides of the debate have readily agreed that the policies they were already urging in this debate are those exactly called for by nuclear winter. This should be no surprise to the congressman. There is one thing new about nuclear winter, I think, that has not been given sufficient weight by the Defense Department. And when Secretary Pearl said that nuclear winter is just a war worse than the kind we had anticipated and that it parallels their own understanding of nuclear war, I think he's overlooked one important aspect of it. And that important aspect of it is that the weapons fired at Soviet cities, in some sense, are fired against our own. So where Secretary Pearl said that there was always an interest on our part not to target Soviet cities, and that there was always a withhold mechanism to prevent collateral casualties, I think he has passed over the fact that nuclear winter provides an entirely new reason for sticking to these withholds, an entirely new reason for not firing missiles at Soviet cities. It's the cities, of course, that have the flammable materials that cause the nuclear winter. And so I think that the major new immediate policy implication of nuclear winter is great interest in both sides in avoiding attacks on cities, interests that were there in a much more passive and latent way before. And I think this is especially important to emphasize because when the time comes to attack cities by our forces or Soviet forces, the war will be well begun. And we're not even sure who will be the person that will push the button in a war in which some cities have already been attacked and one country or the other in extremis decides to fire these final options at cities of the other side. So I think it's very important that the Defense Department review the options in the PSYOP with a new eye to the direct American interests in preventing attacks on Soviet cities. Take place. But a review of the war plans with regard to this new effect of nuclear winter, that attacks on Soviet cities are also attacks on our cities, that there is an important rebound effect, boomerang effect, to attacks on Soviet cities. This is something new. And this should have implications for policy, immediate implications for policy, and those implications should be reflected in much greater restraint in the war plans and possibly the removal of certain options which I think are not necessary for deterrence but would in fact be very counterproductive for us. In particular, options to destroy the 250 smaller cities in the 300 largest Soviet cities, things like that. And second, I think the Defense Department is overlooking a new angle that nuclear winter provides to the Department for persuading the Soviet Union not to fire at American cities. In other words, there is now a direct Soviet interest, if they become persuaded about nuclear winter, in avoiding attacks on our cities. And if the Defense Department is really interested in deterrence, this is a new approach to deterrence, which doesn't cost anything and which could save a lot of lives here as well as the planet if, in fact, a few officials in the Soviet Union do become persuaded at the last moment that it would not be in their interest to fire at these cities even once nuclear war has begun. So while I'm a strong fan of the reductions that Dr. Sagan talked about and an opponent of the Star Wars and the modernization that the administration talks about, I don't view either of those as immediate responses to nuclear winter because both of those will require a long time to take place. But a review of the war plans with regard to this new effect of nuclear winter, that attacks on Soviet cities are also attacks on our cities, that there is an important rebound effect, boomerang effect, to attacks on Soviet cities. This is something new. And this should have implications for policy, immediate implications for policy, and those implications should be reflected in much greater restraint in the war plans and possibly the removal of certain options which I think are not necessary for deterrence but would in fact be very counterproductive for us. In particular, options to destroy the 250 smaller cities in the 300 largest Soviet cities, things like that. And Mr. Chairman, if there is any more time in my 5 minutes, I would make two observations about Secretary Pearl's policy.
Stone, that's exactly the highlighting type of presentation I wanted. Dr. Rathjens?
Thank you. I have a statement here which I'll not read all of it, and I also have another paper which I would hope might be included in the record.
Members here, I believe, and we're certainly happy to have it for the official record.
Thank you. I welcome the opportunity to be here because it seems to me that we need a lot of clarification on this subject. I think the public has been misled
partly by the press, but aided and abetted by the scientific community, I believe, where there's been careless and hyperbolic statements, even irresponsible ones. I think that needs some correction. We have heard statements that nuclear winter will occur or would occur, when in fact it might have been much better if people had said might occur or could occur. We need a correction of that. Even I noted that Secretary Pearl said that given enough nuclear weapons, nuclear winter would occur. I don't subscribe to that at all. It's possible, but we have no basis for claiming that it would occur or even that it is likely. To a large extent, these prognostications have been based on the TAP study about which you heard. But even at the time that study was done, I think it was apparent that it was at best a first approximation and could only give illustrative answers. Since that time, there's been more work, particularly the National Academy has reviewed the state of knowledge, and more recently the Defense Department in the report that was so much discussed this morning. Two main points come out of those two reviews. One, that nuclear winter could happen, and the other, that the uncertainties are enormous and make any meaningful predictions really impossible at this time. Temperatures over continental land masses could drop by tens of degrees and stay that way for weeks or months, but it is just as likely that the effects would be so small that they wouldn't be noticeable at all. We just can't say at this time. Secretary Weinberger's report makes the additional point, with which I strongly agree, that the work of TAPS, and indeed much of the other work, has been based on omission of effects, which, if included, would lead to a lessening of predicted effects. In particular, there have been an omission of the certainty that warm air from over the oceans and from the tropics would infuse over the continents and lead to an amelioration of the kinds of effects that have been predicted. A more serious problem is that all of these calculations have assumed that, at least the TAPS report did, that smoke from fires would spread instantaneously and uniformly over the whole of the hemisphere. That can't happen. It would take time, and during that time, some of the smoke would be removed. When I take account of these kinds of omissions and all of the uncertainties, it's my judgment that the kinds of effects we are most likely to see would be diminutions in temperature in the range of from 0 to 5 degrees rather than 10 degrees, as has commonly been suggested. Now, I'd like to turn to questions of how governments should react, aside from perhaps supporting more research. And here I'm going to assume for the moment, and I want to make it clear that I'm making this as an assumption, that nuclear winter effects would be severe. There are those, doves, nuclear disarmers, I'm one of them, who would argue that greater effects to reduce nuclear stockpiles might be warranted, and that we should depend less on nuclear weapons as instruments of policy. However, I discount those kinds of arguments very heavily, because nobody should be misled that nuclear winter is going to make nuclear war much worse for people of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Any war that could conceivably produce serious nuclear winter effects would be utterly catastrophic in any case. For the fellows in the trenches, the people who are out in Omaha who have to worry about targeting weapons and the PSYOP and that sort of thing, there are kinds of consequences that might be reflected in their work if nuclear winter is taken seriously. One might expect greater emphasis on improving accuracy of weapons delivery, on replacing those of high yield with those of lower yield, on fusing weapons for surface rather than air bursts, even recognizing that that change would mean more fallout. And all of these changes, except possibly just improving accuracy, could imply a larger stockpile of weapons. Those kinds of trade-offs would have to be faced if nuclear winter were taken seriously. It has also been suggested that the prospect of it would induce greater caution, at least in the spring and summer, in military operations that might lead to escalation that could result in nuclear war. But there is the other side of the coin. There could be a greater impetus to use nuclear weapons on a limited scale based on the belief that the nuclear winter prospect could deter further escalation. I discount those arguments, but they're the kinds of logical arguments that I think follow if one believes that the phenomena should be taken seriously. Then there are the arguments of the administration, and we've heard some of those, heard about some of those this morning, that the prospect of nuclear winter justifies increased support for weapons programs that it claims will reduce the likelihood of nuclear war or will lead to arms reduction. And there is the argument that nuclear winter makes the case for a strategic defense initiative more important. I think these arguments are logical, but they're based on false premises. I don't think there's any reason at all to believe that going ahead with the new weapons programs that the administration advocates are going to reduce the likelihood of war or lead to substantial arms reductions. And I don't believe there's the slightest hope of going ahead with the Strategic Defense Initiative leading to a situation where fewer nuclear weapons would be detonated in the United States should a nuclear war occur.
Cut you off here shortly.
All right. Let me just make my last point then, that it does seem to me that in facing up to this question of policy, one has to take account of the possibility that any changes that one might make to alleviate the effects of a possible nuclear winter would carry with them costs. There's no free lunch in this business. Those costs have to be faced. And in view of the uncertainties that obtain at this time with respect to the nuclear winter phenomena, it seems to me that any changes in policy by the government of the United States, or for that matter by other governments, would be premature.
Thank you. Mr. Williamson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be very brief. Almost everything that can be said seems to have been said, perhaps with one exception, and that is that we haven't talked about the basic interests of the United States or the Western alliance in this entire environment that we're talking about today. If we come to a conclusion that the geopolitical balance is not going to change, whether or not nuclear winter turns out to be at some threshold of detonation a real threat, a maybe threat, a sometimes threat, if we can keep our eye on that target, which is how to contain aggression, how to contain the entire Soviet-Western conflict of ideology, economics, and so forth, at a non-combatant level, and then I think we will have taken a major step forward. Deterrence, after all, is a belief that the consequences of some action are inexorable and unacceptable. We may find ourselves in a very strange trap where we believe that certain actions go in that direction, others do not. And I think that to try to tailor policies that look towards less sooty targets, to use a shorthand phrase, is not wise. I think that that is trying to solve with facts and precision. America's desire to always deal in detail is to avoid solving the major problem, which is, are you going to be in a position to deter the other side and anyone else from starting the initial detonation? Once that has happened, once that first detonation has occurred, I suspect escalation, the rule of the jungle, will obtain, and whether it's a nuclear winter or not, it will be nuclear devastation beyond belief. Therefore, the urge has to be to stick to the deterrent side of that issue, and frankly, people keep saying SDI is not a deterrent. I think that a good defense, the existence of a good defense, leaky though it may be, is enough to put uncertainties in the attacker's mind that reduce his desire to start a war, whether there's a nuclear winter component or not. And I think that we ought to try and put things in a perspective of national will, national survival, not after war, but by avoiding that war. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Broad?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would certainly agree with Professor Sagan that our nuclear policy is surrounded by uncertainty, and I guess we all can agree with Secretary Pearl that nuclear devastation is deplorable. But I think the one feature which has not been stressed here is the reason for nuclear weapons in the first place, why they were invented and why they have proliferated, because I believe in that as a clue as to our way out of this dilemma. In World War II, we used nuclear weapons at the end. We spent a great deal of time building bombers and manning them with crews and dropping bombs in the millions. ultimately dropping firebombs in the tens of millions in order to destroy 70-some German cities and 65 Japanese cities, the last two of which were burned using nuclear weapons of a yield smaller than any of our nuclear arsenals today, of our strategic weapons. Obviously, the nuclear weapons were far more efficient, more effective at achieving a military goal, and therefore were at least welcomed in a military sense. In the long run, what we need to look for, of course, are more efficient ways of achieving, or equally efficient ways of achieving military goals without the attendant mass destruction, because nuclear weapons as well as chemical weapons are essentially weapons of mass destruction or large area weapons. I see that then as the promise of decades in the future of high technology, of weapons which are of such great accuracy that they don't need large yields to achieve their military goal of destruction, high probability of destruction of some target. Of course, there will be some targets which are very hard or are characteristically area targets that still may be more effectively attacked with nuclear weapons. But surely, with the advent of more sophisticated weapons, we could look forward to an era in which nuclear weapons were not as an important aspect of our weapons arsenal. In the meantime, in the decades between now and such time when we have less dependence on nuclear forces, our principal objective, I suppose, is to avoid war and to minimize the effects on the short term. Dr. Rastrans mentioned a good many of the short-term kinds of solutions that we might achieve. I might just add one more, and that is the use of nuclear weapons that would penetrate the Earth before detonation. The Earth-penetrating weapons would then be of smaller yield, cause enormous disruption within the target area, but have less so-called collateral damage beyond that target area, cause less blast damage, less smaller fire areas, and therefore contribute less to the smoke load in the atmosphere, which would then lead to the nuclear winter phenomenon. Let me say just a word about the research program as it is structured. Recently, DNA had a conference on the nuclear winter research in which most of the researchers in this country and some from abroad discussed what they have done, what they are doing, and what they plan to do in principally on the matter of the nuclear winter, the generation of the smoke, where the smoke goes, what the atmospheric consequences are. It was not a meeting which discussed the biological effects or sociological effects. My impression was that many factors that were discussed at that meeting are of the nature of mitigating factors that could lead to less of a dramatic effect as the earliest estimates would suggest. Nonetheless, some of the factors could lead to more serious consequences, and the matter of uncertainty was certainly stressed at that time. I think that program, or an augmented program, is certainly worthwhile. It has some additional beneficial factors which are certainly of secondary importance considering the seriousness of this problem. But unlike some applied military research, there's certainly some benefit to climatological research, weather research, to high-altitude physics studies, and to fire research in the work that is currently going on.
All right, thank you. Let's bring our other two panelists up over at this end of the table now, Mr. Snyder, Dr. Snyder, and Mr. Carrier, Dr. Carrier.
Squeeze down better.
Dr. Carrier, you may give us about 5 minutes of what we ought to know at the end of the day here.
Yes, I'm here, as you probably know, because I chaired the committee of the National Academy of Sciences, which conducted a study on this nuclear winter thing. You will see that my remarks are in some way a summary of fragments of previous comments by other witnesses coming as late in the day as it does. As you know, the weapons have as relatively direct effects the manufacturing of nitric oxide, dust and smoke, and those things are lofted high in the atmosphere. They interact with the incoming solar radiation, and they lead to a degradation of the atmosphere. It's clear that those things happen. The great uncertainty has to do with the intensity and the duration of such things. Some of the uncertainties will always be there. You'll not know before a given event at what season of the year it might occur, what weapons might be used, what targets they will actually reach, and things of that sort. So that there are some uncertainties that we are not going to resolve no matter what we do. On the other hand, the very great uncertainties indeed in the amount of smoke and the altitude to which it gets and the rate at which it gets removed can be narrowed. And one could come closer to a definitive statement as to what the degradation of the atmosphere would really be if those questions were resolved to the extent that they can be in a sensible manner. There is also, however, a degree of uncertainty in our ability to predict the response of the atmosphere to even precisely given amounts of contaminant material in the atmosphere. And since we will not conduct any prototype experiments to test such things, it's clear that some of that uncertainty will also remain. The fact is that the committee felt strongly that research to narrow those things which could be narrowed was in order. We recommended such research. As nearly as I can tell by reading the DOD manuscript, which has been referred to earlier this morning, the program they have put in place is consistent with what we recommended. Whether there are gaps in it, I can't tell from that reading. I guess I would like to remind you of one thing, though. Whenever one undertakes an enterprise that is as complicated a composite of individual research tasks as this one is, and in which each of them is as intricate as it is and fraught with statistical kinds of things, it is bound to be true that during the course of the investigation, questions are going to arise that were not anticipated at the beginning of the program. And I would hope that the manner in which this program is coordinated and managed in general would have the flexibility so that as questions arise that were not anticipated, they can be subsumed into the process so that we don't continue to have the holes that we have no way of knowing are there today. It has to be flexibly managed, and I hope that's realized by those who are supporting such things.
Thank you. Dr. Schneider?
Thank you very much. As the last formal witness, I have the self-imposed role of being the junk man. I'll try to bring up those points which I feel may have been missed in the discussion, even though they may not adequately reflect the balance of my overall views. I have submitted for the record, and I have more copies here, a formal testimony. And since much of what I otherwise would have said has been covered, I'll try to go over points which either have been missed or I feel inadequate and then subject to questions later. First thing that I've been concerned about is, and this does relate to the Department of Defense's report, was something that may have been missed, at least the way it was missed to the strength I would have liked to see it. If one read through the discussion of the so-called nuclear winter problem, you clearly came away with a sense that yes, there's a real potential, and yes, there are a great deal of uncertainties. But what was not phrased in the way that would be to my satisfaction was that what you're really looking at is a problem which has to be viewed probabilistically. Uncertainty is not the same thing as no effect, of course. And the way I prefer to view it probabilistically is that there's a higher probability of lower consequences and a lower probability of higher consequences. To translate that, there's a likelihood that even very much limited wars, well below the levels that have been talked about by the TAPS group or even the National Academy of Science baseline, whereby plumes of drifting smoke could randomly move around the hemisphere, selecting almost by a weather roulette places where temperatures could drop below freezing or near freezing for periods of days, not the global scale nuclear winter that we're talking about, but that, should it be in the summer half year or growing season or in the subtropics at any season, could be of tremendous devastation to those people who experience them, as the Florida citrus industry does whenever those transient freeze outbreaks occur. This, to me, would be a fairly high probability on the scale of what we're looking at, even at limited or theater scale wars. And then the lower probability, if one event, would be the global scale full freeze of the kind that so scared the biologists who studied it and suggested the possibility even of extinction of human beings, a possibility which, although I would consider remote, as they said, can't be ruled out. The point is the only way to achieve that would be if there were a full exchange. In fact, if we had a perfectly designed computer launch on warning system where, in fact, we were able to get everything off if somebody came out, then we might be able to approach the levels of smoke where that would be possible. But when you view this as a sliding scale of probability, then you realize that all plans that include more than full-scale exchanges, and everything I have heard from my limited contacts and readings is that nobody rational believes in full-scale exchanges, but there are people who believe in their own rationality and believe in limited exchanges, that even limited exchanges are not necessarily exempt from transient events that could occur. This may have major impact on what we've called the first strike feedback scenario. And an example of it is in my testimony from my colleagues, and the Los Alamos group and the Livermore group and the Soviet group, and we have all run these examples. And one that we just ran is we would put smoke of about half the amount that the Academy assumed in its baseline over both the USSR or the Soviet Union independently. And indeed, it is a situation where those smoke plumes not only cause transient cooling effects over the struck country, but drift back around onto the territory of the continent of the others. And depending on the season and other specific details which are not able to be answered now and probably ever, could have effects elsewhere as well. The non-combatants are therefore significantly affected by this, and I haven't heard it mentioned before that non-combatants also are involved, both as our friends and our adversaries' friends. And in fact, a friend of mine in Canada refers to this as the ICBM problem, the into Canada by mistake. And there are many nations which may be involved in the Non-Proliferation Treaty discussion that's coming up, for which they may call the U.S. and the USSR to task for their possible impact on their territories from any nuclear incursions, and may have something to say, which I didn't see discussed in that report, or I haven't heard discussed before. I'm sure that that my colleague George Rathjens, who I was going to chide for commenting on what temperature decreases were possible, George coming from a now largely political science background, he'll chide me for making comments on policy, but I felt that that issue at least should be considered. Another area which has not been, in my opinion, adequately explored, in the DOD report I read a short paragraph in there from FEMA about civil defense, and regardless of one's views about whether civil defense is effective or not, it certainly struck me as a strange statement to say that because there was so much scientific uncertainty surrounding nuclear winter, therefore FEMA couldn't make any plans. I always believed that strategic planning was based upon anticipating a whole host of events whose probabilities could be an order of magnitude or more below that for nuclear winter, and that it would be certainly legitimate activity for us to ask, so what if? That, in fact, is the purpose, I always thought, of strategic planning. And obviously, whether or not they should make any modification, I don't know, but clearly one shouldn't use the argument that there's technical uncertainty and therefore we have nothing to say in policy area. I believe that's true for almost every aspect of this problem. Secretary Pearl said that with regard to biological consequences, the question from Congresswoman Schneider, no relation, that it misses the point. Actually, in a sense, I have a philosophical disagreement with the Secretary there, as I did Congressman Scheuer when I testified before this committee 4 years ago over a different issue, over the greenhouse effect question with CO2 with the Department of Energy, who were de-emphasizing the social and biological consequences of CO2, arguing that we had many uncertainties in the physical science. It's not that I disagree with the fact that there are uncertainties in the physical science, but the question of so what, if the event the physicists are looking at occurs, should in fact not follow but precede the physical science investigation. And it has a scientific component because the variables that we look at and try to study can be influenced by what impact assessors tell us. We want to find out, is it 3 meters of ice over the winter that counts? And as Dr. Sagan has said, and Richard Pearl has agreed, this is terrible, and we all agree, but what about a flickering decreased cooling? Biologists tell us in some seasons that's almost as severe. And finally, Also, Secretary Pearl commented that there might be a non-utility, if you will, from a U.S.-USSR scientific exchange based on the fact that the Soviet scientists have official positions. And in my experience in that regard, he's not incorrect that it's hard to shake them from the position they come with. On the other hand, if we really want the Soviet scientists to understand the round of uncertainty associated with nuclear winter and what it means, it's very difficult to do that from the literature alone. There really aren't 50 scientists in the world, in my personal opinion, who are capable of evaluating all these details. No individual one is, and that's a 50 collective, and we have to meet together to do that. And even if they're not going to admit it, they'll learn how to read the literature better if we're able to meet with them face to face, and they bring that kind of information home. And finally, the bottom, and again, this is a personal observation, line to me of nuclear winter is not that we have a detailed set of certainties about what will happen. In fact, I'm personally glad that we may never be able to have a specific scenario where on a given day the winds are such, the humidity is such, it's the following season, what's going to happen? Because if we were able to do that, then nuclear winter or some weather effect could be factored in as a military strategy. And indeed, one can concoct, and we can do this on individual days in our models, scenarios whereby we or they end up better off or worse off, thereby increasing rather than decreasing the probability of exchanges. Fortunately, the technical uncertainties conspire to prevent us from having any confidence in any such detailed scenario and force us into talking in broad sweeps like it is reasonably probable that flickering quick freezes or large-scale events could occur. And while I have no doubt that research to narrow those uncertainties will put decision-making on a firmer basis, I don't think we'll ever be in the position where that level of detailed scenario will be easily possible, and from a personal point of view, I'm glad of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schneider. That completes the presentations of the panel. Congressman Wirth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank all of you for your extraordinary patience. I think you also understand what it's like to be a younger member of the Congress while everybody at the top of the panel questions first and you come last. Seniority looks better to us all the time, as you can tell. Let me ask you a couple of questions, and I might start with you, Dr. Stone, and go down, and you can respond or not if you want. The first question is, is the Pentagon's response to the amendment drafted last year and attached to the defense appropriation bill, is that response adequate? And if not, what should be added? That's question number one. Question number two, and you all may have a reaction, may not, is the amount of research funding adequate to the task, particularly that which is in the NSF, or would be done by independent researchers? Well, that's clear. Maybe you all could run down with a quick reaction to that double question.
Well, I pass on the second question, but on the first question, Congressman Wirth, I think there is no reference, as far as I can tell, in the report to reviewing the war plans with regard to this new imperative suggested by nuclear winter of avoiding attacks on cities. A new reason has been given in our own interests of avoiding attacks on cities. And this is not referred to in any way in the report, even though, of course, you've asked for strategic implications. Yes. Even, just to add one sentence to this, in October 1980, there was a government directive that abandoned the requirement that we be able to destroy 70% of Soviet economic recovery and war-supporting assets. This is the category, of course, in which we do attack cities. We don't attack cities per se, but we target the areas in which there is industry and economic support. The requirement that we be able to destroy 70% of that economic industry and war support was dropped in 1980, but according to the best observer I know of the war plans, Desmond Ball, he says in an important article, it still remains the case that the top 300 urban industrial areas in the Soviet Union will continue to receive about the same amount of nuclear firepower and to suffer about the same amount of damage, end quote, as they would have before. That means that we are targeting most of the 300 largest cities in the Soviet Union. And since I'm not sure that's necessary for deterrence, And since it could be very much not in our interest to fire at those cities, I think the war plan should be reviewed with regard to whether we've considered this new element. And I think a major effort should be mounted to persuade the Soviet Union that changes in their war plans and in their war plan options are in order, even though it can't be verified by the two sides.
Thank you. Go on. Dr. Brody?
My impression of the report on reading it was that it was fairly responsive, and I did not miss the lack of information about biological consequences, since I was mostly concerned and interested in whether, in fact, the extent to which the phenomena was to occur or not was being treated adequately. I thought the report was fairly frank about that. As far as the policy of city avoidance, which is certainly an easy thing to contemplate, I think when it comes to implementation with the actual targeting philosophy that's dictated by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and executed by the JSTPS in Omaha, it would mean a major change in their whole procedure, since a great deal, as Professor Stone has pointed out, a great deal of their targeting would have to be avoided or rethought as to the priorities. Many of those targets are urban targets. They're leadership targets. They're military targets, and they are urban industrial type targets that would be inseparable from those urban areas. If you recall, certainly the larger part of both Hiroshima and Nagasaki burned with very small yield weapons. We are talking about cities that are only several times larger being attacked with more than a single weapon of many times the yield. It would be difficult for any of those targets to be attacked without seriously damaging the rest of the city. So it would mean a great many of the targets on our target list would have to be reconsidered.
Dr. Ratzinger?
Well, on the response from the Defense Department, I would give it a very differentiated grade in contrast to Dr. Sagan. I think the first two parts, which characterize the state of our knowledge, are exceedingly well done and thought out. There's not all that much detail, but I think those two parts of the report are very good, and the last part is outrageously bad. The part that has to do with policy and what might be done, and I think that I would agree with Dr. Sagan. They should be sent back to do their homework. There are lots of kinds of trade-offs that could be explored and should be explored for the committee. Just to give you one example, they should look into the question of changing the PSYOP to use more surface bursts and penetrating bursts, as Dr. Brody has suggested, to look and see how much fallout increases in order to reduce the amount of smoke by a given amount. Those are the kind of trade-off analyses that have to be done to do anything meaningful in looking at possible changes in policy. So I have a very differentiated view as to the different parts of the report. Now, as to the budget, the allocation of resources to this problem, I don't know what to say. If you're going to take money from aid to dependent children programs to spend more on research in this area, I wouldn't give it another nickel. And there are other social programs that I think are far more demanding of a few more $1 million than work on nuclear winter. On the other hand, if it's going to come out of the MX budget, I'd fund everybody I could find in Lafayette Park to do anything they wanted on it, and everybody else I could find. So my answer to that, this is a problem for you fellows and the ladies too. You got to. You're stuck with the problem. Where's the money going to come from? If it's come from social programs, I think we're spending more than enough research on nuclear winter. If it's going to come from the DOD, I think there's a lot of money there that could be better spent than on weapons programs if it were spent on nuclear winter.
Thank you. Mr. Williamson?
I have to agree with George that the first two parts of the Pentagon's report are pretty good. I would like to say that they ignore, or perhaps twist a bit, the last point, and that is, and so is this discussion. We're talking about essentially changing policies to make the world safe for nuclear war. I think that's very dangerous. I think it's extraordinarily dangerous to talk about a targeting philosophy that lets you think you can get away with it, because I don't think you're going to. I think that whatever happens once you've started this particular form of war, escalation is going to occur, and the results, whether nuclear winter or not, are going to be unacceptable, totally unacceptable. Emphasis, therefore, should not be on research to allow us to find soot-free targets. I think that is not a wise move. I think to prove to ourselves there is no nuclear winter, which is a potential outcome of a lot of research, doesn't change the geopolitical equation. Obviously, it's a good scientific program. If it turns out to generate a worldwide weather model that we can trust, something that we've spent 15 to 25 years trying, haven't gotten anywhere on because it hasn't had a nuclear or a military or something drive behind it, well worth it.
We can put some good atmospheric research in under the rubric of defense, and that would be worth the whole load. Is that what you're suggesting, Mr. Williamson? Thank you. By the way, isn't that an argument that you make of looking at targeting or looking at making the world safer for nuclear war, the argument you were making earlier, exactly the same argument that one would make against SDI?
No. The point about SDI, whether you believe in space lasers or not, is, again, a probabilistic question. Do you confuse the attack planner to the point he does not dare attack? You don't have to have a perfect defense. All you have to have is one that he thinks is going to screw up his planning.
So you're just thinking the uncertainty factor is we have $1 trillion worth of uncertainty going in there.
It doesn't matter whether you call it an SDI or a galosh. If the guy attacking has to worry about something other than the weather and the fact that his weapons are old and that fuses don't always work, you've doubled his problem.
Dr. Carey?
Yep. I also think that the physical science part of the DOD report was excellent, reflected the current state of knowledge very well. I'm not qualified to talk on the policy parts of it. As far as the budget's concerned, it seems to me that in the general amount of money is probably what can be sensibly used at this stage of development. It has to be understood that it isn't going to be over with in 1 year, that there are going to be other questions that evolve out of this and which have to be tackled. And as I said earlier, it will be done best if there's enough flexibility, and that means flexibility in the amount of funds, small increments from the total, so that as things arise, they can be attacked in a timely way rather than put off until the next budget cycle comes along.
As to the adequacy of the report, I share most of my colleagues' views that it was 2 reports, and I will comment largely on the first one, not because I feel unqualified, but because I'd better not on the second one. The first part of the report, the scientific part, I would agree that there are aspects of it that are very good. My complaint, which I stated before, is I felt that although it was implicit, it would have been preferable had it been explicit that we're viewing the problem probabilistically. And probabilistically means that there are probabilities that things can happen, not that we shouldn't do anything because there's uncertainty. And I think there's a distinction between uncertainty as an excuse to delay and uncertainty as to the exact nature of the details, not uncertainty that there would be things happening. And I would have preferred an emphasis, a greater emphasis on probability, although I felt the report was largely fair. Critics of TAPS and of Carl Sagan in particular have accused him of understating the uncertainties. I suppose one could state with due respect to my friends over there that perhaps the DOD report somewhat overstated the uncertainties in my scientific opinion, but that by and large I feel it was a generally fair report in that regard. The only other area that I was bothered with that it was missing is that what the low level of combat might mean for small amounts of fires and small amounts of smoke, theater war, first strike issues, and so forth, which didn't seem to me to be addressed in the scientific side. And there is a probabilistic way of, at least one can probabilistically make some comments that perhaps there would be side effects from those, and I didn't see that there, although again, I don't think this calls for major expansion, but at least some recognition of those issues. As I said earlier, in the second half of the report, I didn't see much about non-combatants. I don't know what we can say about that or what other people's attitudes might be, but that somebody perhaps might investigate how that might influence either our policy or that of our adversaries. As for the question of funding of research science, it's true that the amount of effort that we put in will never give us, no matter how much we do, detailed and complete definitive ability to solve every problem, which I personally said I believe is good. But when you ask what will more funding do, you have to say for what. What funding does is it speeds up the rate at which the scientific community can increasingly give you credible statements about probabilities and consequences. So at the present level of funding, one just defers to a longer time, the rate at which such statements become increasingly, in a probabilistic sense, more credible. For example, we've had at National Center for Atmospheric Research some small help from Defense Nuclear Agency, and what it's done is it's built a great deal of leverage into our system because we've been able to hire a few people to investigate parts of our modeling effort that we couldn't have done for many years, building on a very large effort that was already underway, getting high leverage for them, and having us produce results at a faster rate. Obviously, more money means that we do that many more things faster. But there are some aspects, such as large-scale field experiments, which may not have enough funding in it at present, and you'd have to discuss that with DNA people and others to see just exactly how the plan that was put together by Alan Hecht and the National Climate Program Office with the help of many other agencies, how that plan could be implemented at present level of funding. I'm skeptical that it could be done in terms of large experiments, but again, you'll have to ask the others. And then finally, with regard to what George Ratzian said, what does it do for our models and otherwise? The models that we use for nuclear winter studies are the same models we use for carbon dioxide, greenhouse effect, trace gases, Arctic haze, El Nino, and so forth. And the improvements that we make in that regard make those other problems more credible too. So in a sense, the government isn't wasting its money, in my opinion, by improving them. But the real question is the rate at which you want to do that versus doing other things.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. We greatly appreciate your being here and your patience, and I want to thank Mr. Udall and Mr. Scheuer for having such a thorough hearing and doing it so expeditiously. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you.
Scheuer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one last question. On this business of certainty, we all act in our everyday lives in science and politics and business at home and our families with less than absolute certitude. We very rarely have a 1.0 linear relationship between cause and effect. I mean, almost all doctors tell people not to smoke three packs of cigarettes a day. But we don't have a linear relationship between smoking and lung cancer because you can't put people into a laboratory. We've never achieved that degree of scientific exactitude. Although, as a matter of judgment, it's perfectly clear that heavy smoking ain't good for you. By the same criterion, it seems to me that while we haven't described nuclear winter with scientific precision, and that there are sort of fuzzy parameters, that as a phenomenon it's accepted. And the Defense Department accepts it as something that's real out there. Now, the question is, what do they want to do about it? If I hear Secretary Pearl, he seems to feel, well, it's real and it's there, but it hasn't changed anything very much. We still think SDI is the best deterrent factor, and we still believe that we have to avoid a nuclear confrontation of any kind. My question to you is, does it change anything? Does it change the U.S.-Soviet Union deterrent relationship? How should the emergence of nuclear winter as a real force out there, as a real potential for incredible additional damage, how should that affect our thinking? How should that affect the negotiations that started this morning in Geneva? How should it be factored into our nuclear strategy thinking?
Answer yes or no.
In absence of anyone else, I think that you've touched on an important point, and that is that the United States policies tend to respond to U.S. citizens. So that if the American citizens share with you concern about this new and horrible phenomenon as perhaps changing our perceptions of nuclear war, then the policies that the United States would be likely to forward would take some change. if the Soviet Union does not have an identical view of the new dangers, and their policies do not change, the asymmetry, which I think Dick Pearl mentioned, becomes one that is kind of expensive for the U.S. because it begins to attack, I think, the U.S. will to resist not nuclear war if it occurs, but the kinds of political posturing backed by the threat of war, which is backed by the threat of escalation to nuclear war, which the Soviets are very good at. And I think that is a real danger, that we learn too much and cannot teach the other side the equivalent danger of the equivalent evil.
Yes.
I think you really asked two questions, and I'd like to address both. One is the question, how do you deal with uncertainty and risk in cases where you really don't know very much? And I think that the point that I would make is you do not do it by doing what we call worst-case analysis when there is a large cost to be paid for hedging against that worst case. You have to take account of the real likelihoods. Now, let's take the nuclear winter phenomena. I believe it is not likely to be very serious, but it could be. I believe there's not a 1 chance in a million that the SDI kind of defense that the President has proposed is ever going to be very effective. But if I did the worst case analysis, and if there were no costs involved, I'd say, let's go ahead with an SDI. You know, there might be a 1 chance in a million that it would work and it would prevent nuclear winter. I think that'd be absolutely crazy because we'd be spending $1 trillion on an insurance policy that probably would not be effective against a threat that is improbable. So you just have to take into account the probability. There's no way to avoid that, and to assume that you assume the worst and then sort of say, well, because you might have a nuclear winter, you should behave as if it will happen, I think is a grave error. Now, as to your second point, how ought it to affect Soviet-American relations and the negotiations that are going on? I submit it shouldn't affect them at all at this point in time, and I say that because it does seem to me the damage that the United States and the Soviet Union could expect to incur in any kind of a war from blast effects, from disruption of transportation, starvation, all the other effects we've talked about for many years, are just so overwhelmingly large that I cannot imagine taking a different position on any kind of an issue in those negotiations because of the added effect of nuclear winter. And I would go even further. I would say I wouldn't imagine taking a different position even if I thought the probability of nuclear winter were very high. I happen to think it's low.
Very briefly, in my own view of how nuclear winter affects things, first thing I would have to say is the principal customer would be the non-combatants. I agree with George Rathjens and others before that things were bad enough among the combatants even without nuclear winter, and how non-combatants would view this and how it would affect our relations with them and others, I think really has to be considered further. The second thing is arguing probabilistically, as I've done before, saying that there's a higher probability of lesser events. Those lesser events, which could be transient quick freezes anywhere in the hemisphere, can still be very serious for us or others, and then I feel that we have to more seriously consider those wars which are considered more probable, namely theater war or limited or even possible first strikes, that where we're customers for nuclear winter, like information, is on these shorter term or more believable wars. And finally, the last point about nuclear winter is there are those who believe in civil defense or who believe in survivability, and for them it has a message for either limited or non-limited wars. And that would be my short answer.
Yes, Dr. Stone.
I think in discussing this, I'm sorry, Professor Carrier, after you.
I was really going to say that there is another way of dealing with uncertainty that is sometimes possible, and that is to reduce it to levels where the definitiveness of the statement that you can make is a worthwhile improvement, and that's what I think we ought to be about.
I think in this question of probability, it's important to view nuclear winter not only as a specific problem, but also as a metaphor for all the other different things that we don't expect, as not long ago we didn't expect nuclear winter, but which might happen. And if you add together all of the things which we don't know about but might happen, I think there is a substantial likelihood that some of them will happen. And in this regard, The 1975 study of the National Academy of Sciences talked not only about a major climatic change, but also talked about problems in the oceans, in the food chain, and problems on the land. And as I understand Congressman Worth's amendment, it's supposed to elicit from the Defense Department some study of other problems like biological ones that might arise independently, not only biological ones that would arise as a result of the cold and dark of nuclear winter. In that regard, as I understand the amendment, it's an attempt to pursue what was being pursued by the National Academy of Sciences in 1975, a broad-scale investigation into other unexpected things that might go wrong. If I'm right about that, then Secretary Pearl is not, because I think he referred to the investigation of these other elements as being elements derivative to the problem of nuclear winter. Finally, if I had to summarize what it seems to me is learned from this, we're reinforced in our view that there can be no victory in nuclear war, and we've discovered that there is a great common interest in there not being any revenge.
Tim, anything else?
Again, let me thank you, gentlemen. And due to the late hour, we're even putting together a special transportation operation going out to Dulles Airport, which will be leaving soon after here. If any of you would like to take advantage of that, Dr. Schneider is doing so, and that's in respect. If any of you have to go to Dulles, hook up with Steve, and we're getting you out there. Thank you all. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you again. It was a very thoughtful and stimulating panel. We're grateful to you. Okay.
No, that's kind of wanders.
Sure. I'll be Steve here. Gee.
Gee, I'm the only one.